Hello, and welcome back to our little corner of the night. It's time to let the day dissolve, to settle into your pillows, and let the darkness become your blanket. Before we begin our journey into the shadows, I'd love for you to leave a comment telling me what time it is for you and what part of the world you're listening from. There's a certain comfort in knowing that we're all sharing this moment together. A quiet community of listeners scattered across the globe, united under different moons. It helps make the silence feel a little less lonely. And if you enjoy our time together, a simple like and a subscription to the channel ensures you'll never miss another descent into the dark. Now, get comfortable. Let my voice be your guide. Let the stories begin. First story: The Lighthouse Keeper's Guest. Thomas had always sought the edges of the world, those forgotten corners where the clamor of humanity faded into a distant hum, a whisper barely heard above the wind. It was this yearning for quietude, for the profound embrace of isolation, that led him to the granite teeth of the Blackwater Skerry and the solitary beacon that stood sentinel upon it. For a lighthouse keeper, Blackwater was the apotheosis of remoteness, a jagged, unforgiving rock, barely 100 yards across at its widest point, thrusting defiantly from the churned gray of the North Atlantic. A full mile of treacherous, current-swept water separated it from the nearest stretch of desolate, uninhabited coastline. He arrived on a blustery March afternoon, the air thick with salt and the shriek of gulls. The supply boat, a sturdy, no-nonsense vessel named the Cormorant, deposited his meager belongings and a year's worth of provisions before chugging away, leaving him wrapped in an immensity of ocean and sky. The solitude, he had to admit, was immediate and absolute. The thrumming of the great lamp above him, the rhythmic crash of waves against the rock below, and the insistent wind of the wind through the tower's ironwork became the soundtrack to his new existence. And for months, it was perfect. His days settled into a methodical rhythm, each hour a carefully placed brick in the wall of his contentment. He polished the brass, trimmed the wicks, meticulously checked the lenses, and wound the intricate clockwork mechanism that kept the beam sweeping its solitary arc across the dark waters. He read, he wrote, he cooked simple meals, and he watched the endless, mesmerizing dance of the ocean. Sometimes, a curious seal would surface near the rock, its dark eyes mirroring his own solitary gaze. Other times, the skeletal masts of distant trawlers would creep across the horizon, faint smudges against the vast canvas of the sea, reminders of a world he had willingly left behind. The silence was not empty. It was full, a deep, resonant hum that allowed his thoughts to unfurl like sails in a steady breeze. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, truly himself, unburdened by the expectations or intrusions of others. The Blackwater Skerry was his kingdom, the lighthouse his castle, and the endless expanse of the Atlantic his silent, watchful companion. Then came the boat. It was a morning in late autumn, the sky a bruised purple, promising a storm. As Thomas conducted his routine sweep of the island's narrow, wave-worn perimeter, his gaze caught an anomaly. Tucked into a rocky inlet, nestled amidst a tangle of kelp and sea debris, was a small, wooden rowboat. It was old, weathered, its paint long since peeled, but unmistakably empty. There were no oars, no fishing gear, no sign of any cargo or previous occupant. It simply was. He frowned, a ripple of unease disturbing the placid surface of his day. Derelict vessels occasionally washed ashore, certainly. But this one felt different. Too small, too innocuous, yet somehow too deliberate in its appearance. Still, the practical man in him asserted itself. It was a potential hazard, and a curiosity. He spent the better part of an hour battling the rising tide and the slippery, barnacle-encrusted rocks to drag it higher, securing its painter to a heavy iron ring set into the stone wall of the lighthouse's base. It was just a boat, he told himself, adrift from some distant, forgotten shore. He dismissed it, returning to the comforting routine of his lamp and his solitude. That night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the thick glass of the lantern room. Rain lashed against the tower, a drumming cadence that usually lulled Thomas into a deep, dreamless sleep. But sleep did not come. Instead, a peculiar sound began to insinuate itself into the symphony of the storm. It was faint at first, barely perceptible above the wind's shriek and the wave's roar. A soft, wet sound, a squelch. It seemed to emanate from the ground floor, the storage and workroom directly beneath his living quarters. Thomas tensed, his body rigid in the narrow bunk. He listened, straining his ears, convinced it was merely the storm, perhaps water seeping in somewhere, or the old building settling. But no, it was distinct. A rhythmic, deliberate sound. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Like bare feet, wet and heavy, moving slowly across a stone floor. His heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He knew, with an icy certainty that defied all logic, that it was not the wind, it was not the rain, it was not the building. He sat up, his breath catching in his throat. The sounds continued, moving, it seemed, from one side of the room to the other, then pausing, then resuming. He slid from his bunk, his own feet soundless on the cold floor. He crept to the internal iron staircase that led down to the ground floor. He stood there, hand gripping the cold railing, listening, utterly terrified. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity, then abruptly ceased. The only thing he could hear then was the storm and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. He stood frozen for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for the squelching to resume. It did not. Eventually, shivering, he crept back to his bunk. He lay awake until dawn, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old lighthouse magnified into a threat. The next morning, Thomas descended to the ground floor with a trepidation he hadn't known since childhood. The room was just as he had left it. Tools hung neatly on their pegs. Coils of rope lay tidily in their bins. The floor, though damp from the storm, showed no obvious puddles, no footprints. Nothing. A prickle of self-doubt began to form. Had it been a dream? The exhaustion of a sleepless night twisting the sounds of the storm into something sinister. He spent the morning meticulously cleaning and checking the entire ground floor, searching for a leak, for anything that could explain the sounds. He found nothing. By midday, bathed in the comforting familiarity of his routine, he began to relax. It had been his imagination, of course. The isolation was getting to him. A normal reaction, surely, for a man living alone on a rock. But then, as he reached for his logbook on the small desk in his living quarters, he noticed it. The logbook, which he had left closed and perfectly aligned with the edge of the desk, was now open. Not fully open, but slightly ajar, as if someone had just finished closing it hastily. And it was rotated a few degrees to the left, his breath hitched. He stared at the book, his mind scrambling for an explanation. A draft? An earthquake? No, the lighthouse was built to withstand the worst of gales, and there had been no tremors. He had closed it himself last night, after noting the changing weather. His hand trembled as he reached out, touching the worn leather cover. He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness, an uncomfortable tremor just beneath his skin. He told himself it was absurd. A book slightly moved? Coincidence? He was tired. That night, the squelching returned. It was softer this time, more insistent, seemingly directly beneath his bunk. He heard the faint, wet drag, a sound that seemed to part the very air around it. He lay there, rigid, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the sounds continued, slow and deliberate, moving now towards the narrow pantry directly off the main living area. He heard a faint scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. Then the sounds faded. He did not sleep. The first light of dawn found him pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had to prove it. He had to. He forced himself to descend. The living quarters were bathed in the gray light of morning. His eyes scanned the room, desperate to find anything. And there it was. His chair, which he meticulously tucked under the small dining table each night, was pulled out, just a few inches, as if someone had risen from it or was about to sit down. His half-eaten biscuit from last night, left on a small plate, was gone, and the faint, briny smell he had noticed last night, dismissed as merely the tang of the sea, was now stronger. It clung to the air, thick and pervasive, a cold, cloying scent of stagnant water, and something unidentifiable, like deep-sea mud. It permeated his living quarters, settling into the fabric of his clothes, the pages of his books, the very air he breathed. Panic began to rise, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be. But he saw nothing. Only the moved chair, the vanished biscuit, the smell that was now everywhere. He spent the next few days in a torment of paranoia. He began setting small traps, a piece of string tied taut across the doorway to the pantry, a scattering of fine dust on the floor of the ground level, a carefully balanced stack of small, empty tins in the middle of his living room floor, designed to topple with the slightest disturbance. He even rigged a makeshift bell, hanging it with a delicate thread from the ceiling above the main staircase, its clapper positioned to strike if anything brushed past it. Every morning, the string was snapped, the dust disturbed, the tins scattered, the bell silent. It was as if whatever moved through his lighthouse was both clumsy enough to knock things over, yet agile and silent enough to avoid his crude alarms. The sounds continued almost every night. The soft, wet squelch, the faint drag, sometimes a soft thud, as if something heavy had been set down, sometimes a tiny, almost imperceptible splash, always from below, or just outside his immediate line of sight. The items moved became more significant. His spare lantern, carefully hung on a hook, was found on the floor. A can of preserved peaches from his pantry was open, half-eaten, despite his strict rationing. His charts, folded neatly, were found spread out on the table, their folds disturbed. One morning, he found his only spare set of keys, which he kept in a locked drawer, lying on the console beside the lamp mechanism, glinting innocently in the morning light. The drawer was still locked. The horror was not in confrontation. but in the utter lack of it. It was the certainty that he was no longer alone, but the crushing, maddening inability to prove it, to see it, to understand it. He would burst into rooms, shouting, wielding a heavy wrench, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to find empty space, the air thick with that briny, unnatural smell. He swept the beam of his powerful torch into every shadow, behind every crate, under every bunk. But the darkness yielded nothing but familiar objects. He stopped sleeping, or rather, sleep became a fearful, fitful thing, haunted by imagined squelches and the phantom scent of the deep. He became gaunt, his eyes hollowed, perpetually scanning the periphery of his vision. He started talking to himself, whispering arguments against the unseen, pleading with it, then cursing it. He would sit, clutching a heavy iron poker, for hours in the main living area, staring at the pantry door, waiting, just waiting for a sign. But the signs only came when he wasn't looking. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. He began to feel an unseen gaze upon him, a cold, steady presence that followed him from room to room. He would turn abruptly, convinced he would finally catch a glimpse of something, anything. But there was never anything there, just the pervasive smell, the slightly skewed objects, the silent, mocking disarray. He tried to signal the mainland, flashing distress codes with the lamp, but a storm had blown in days ago, cutting him off, and the radio was static-filled. He was truly alone with his tormentor. One afternoon, he came up from the ground floor after his checks. The briny smell was particularly strong that day, clinging to his nostrils, making him feel nauseous. As he reached his living quarters, he froze. On his neatly made bunk, a single, glistening, wet footprint. Not a human print. It was too wide, too splayed, with an unnatural number of toes, and it gleamed with a faint, greenish luminescence in the dim light of the room. It was unmistakably wet, as if something had just stepped onto his bed. He stared at it, his mind shattering. It was real. It was undeniably real. And it had been on his bed. He stumbled backwards, knocking over his chair with a crash. He scrambled up the spiral staircase, heart exploding in his chest, ignoring the painful protests of his knees. He reached the lantern room, the glass dome bathed in the fading light of the afternoon. He stared out at the boundless ocean, searching for the cormorant, for any sign of human life. There was nothing, just the endless, indifferent waves, and the vast, empty sky. Below him, in the silent heart of the lighthouse, he knew, with a certainty that was worse than any vision, that the squelching had begun again. And this time, it sounded closer than ever. Second story, the murmur of the Mycelium. Dr. Aris Thorne had always found solace in the quietude of the natural world, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the city labs where she usually spent her days. Her specialization was mycology, a field often overlooked, yet one she believed held the keys to unlocking some of Earth's most profound secrets. Her current obsession, a theory considered fringe by most of her peers, posited that certain ancient fungal networks possessed a form of rudimentary consciousness, communicating not through chemical signals alone, but through subtle, detectable electrical impulses. To test this audacious hypothesis, she sought the oldest, most undisturbed forest she could find, a place where the roots ran deep and the very earth hummed with forgotten life. She found it tucked away in the forgotten folds of the Carpathian foothills, a vast, primeval expanse known locally as the Whisperwood. Its name, she was told, came from the perpetual, almost imperceptible rustling of its ancient canopy, a sound that seemed to carry secrets on the wind. The cabin she rented was a relic itself, built from rough-hewn timber, its windows gazing out upon a sea of moss-draped trees. It was exactly what she needed: isolation, proximity to her subject, and an undeniable sense of ancientness that seeped into her very bones. Her equipment, state-of-the-art and painstakingly calibrated, was a marvel of bioelectrical engineering. Delicate probes designed to penetrate the soil without disturbance, sensors so sensitive they could register the faintest energetic flicker, and a sophisticated decoding interface that translated complex electrical patterns into visual and auditory representations. She spent the first few days setting up, meticulously mapping out grids around the cabin, burying her probes deep into the rich, dark soil, ensuring minimal impact on the delicate ecosystem. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something ancient and vital. On the third night, under a sky choked with 1,000,000 stars, Aris sat before her console, a faint hum emanating from the intricate machinery. She had calibrated everything, double-checked her connections, and now, with a deep breath, she activated the main array. The screen flickered to life, displaying a chaotic storm of green and blue lines, a visual representation of the raw electrical chatter beneath the forest floor. It was far more intense than she had anticipated, a dense tapestry of signals. Filtering for coherent patterns, she murmured to herself, her fingers dancing over the holographic keyboard. The chaotic storm begun to coalesce, the noise receding, replaced by discernible rhythms. A gasp escaped her lips. There it was, not just random noise, but intricate, complex patterns, repeating, echoing, intertwining. It was a language, she realized, in its purest, most fundamental form. And it was vast, unimaginably vast. The mycelial network beneath the whisperwood was not merely a collection of individual fungi. It was a single, sprawling entity, an ancient, subterranean superorganism spanning acres, perhaps even miles. Its electrical pulses thrummed with a unified purpose, a collective hum that suggested not mere biological function, but a profound, undeniable consciousness. It was alive in a way no one had ever truly conceived. Aris felt a thrill, cold and exhilarating, course through her veins. She had been right, more right than she could have ever dreamed. Days turned into nights, and Aris lost herself in the alien symphony. She worked tirelessly, refining her algorithms, digging deeper into the patterns. The initial excitement of discovery soon morphed into a more sober, almost reverent awe. The signals were incredibly complex, hinting at a vast database of information, a living archive. Yet something about them felt passive, like echoes. Then she found it, a repetitive, almost melodic sequence that stood out from the ambient thrum. She isolated it, ran it through a more advanced decoding filter she had developed for processing neural data. What appeared on the screen wasn't a complex thought or a command. It was a flash, a vivid, fleeting image. A deer, startled, frozen mid-leap, sunlight dappling through leaves. Then a sharp, piercing sound, a crack, and darkness. Aris froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sequence repeated, each time the image slightly less vibrant, the sound more muffled, as if fading. It was a memory, the last dying thought of a creature. Over the next few days, her initial wonder began to twist into something unsettling. She discovered more such sequences, the frantic flutter of a bird's wings as it plummeted from the sky, the final, soft breath of a fox curled in its den. Each memory was a fragment, a last impression, stored within the vast electrical network of the mycelium. The forest wasn't just conscious, it was a living mausoleum, a repository of every final sensation, every last fear, every last flicker of life that had returned to its soil. The mycelium absorbed, processed, and perpetually replayed these echoes. Her sleep became restless. The idea was too grand, too terrifying to fully grasp. The forest floor, seemingly inert, was alive with the fading whispers of the dead. She found herself sitting for hours, listening to the final moments of creatures, some majestic, some small, all meeting their end within the embrace of the mycelial network. It was a morbid, beautiful, and profoundly lonely experience. Then came the hiker. The signal was different this time, more complex, infused with a distinct human terror. It was a jumble of disjointed thoughts, flashes of a worried face, the feel of cold, wet earth, the overwhelming sensation of being lost, utterly and hopelessly lost. The memory was clearer than the animal ones, more recent perhaps. She saw a thick, woolen sweater, a worn hiking boot, the glint of a cheap compass. The final sensation was a bone-deep chill, a numbing exhaustion, and then a profound, heartbreaking regret. The signal repeated, a loop of despair, gradually fading like the others. Aris traced the signal's origin. It came from a small, rocky outcrop about 1.5 miles north of her cabin, a place she had noted on her initial survey. She remembered an old local legend about a hiker who had vanished in the Whisperwood decades ago, his body never found. Now she knew why. He had become part of the forest, his final moments imprinted onto its ancient, living memory bank. The realization settled over her like a shroud. The beauty of her discovery was overshadowed by its chilling implication. The forest was not generating its own thoughts. It was a vast, silent listener, an eternal recorder. And she was now part of its soundscape, an active listener among the echoes. The nights grew colder, the wind through the Whisperwood sounding less like a whisper and more like a sigh. Aris found herself checking the cabin's locks more frequently, a primeval unease stirring within her. She was a trespasser, not just on land, but on the very consciousness of the forest. One particularly dark night, the kind of night where the moon was a sliver and the stars were hidden by a thick blanket of clouds, Aris was reviewing some new data. The usual hum of ambient mycelial chatter filled her headphones, punctuated by the familiar, fading echoes of a deer's last leap, a bird's final fall. She had grown accustomed to the morbid symphony, almost found a strange comfort in its predictable sorrow. Then a new frequency broke through. It wasn't the chaotic burst of a newly deceased creature being absorbed. It was structured, deliberate, and it was sharp, cutting through the background hum with an intensity that made her jolt upright. She quickly isolated the signal. The patterns were unlike anything she had encountered before. They weren't passive replays of fading memories. These were dynamic, evolving, and they held a distinct resonance. As she fed the new data into her decoding algorithm, the usual visualizations of abstract patterns began to shift. The green and blue lines didn't just undulate, they formed shapes, primitive, yet discernible. The first image was subtle, almost subliminal, a blurred outline of the cabin, her cabin. Her blood ran cold. She adjusted the filters, her hands trembling slightly, the image sharpened. It wasn't just the cabin. It was a specific window. Her laboratory window. The one she was looking out of right now. A new sequence of signals began. Rhythmic. Persistent. She decoded it. The translation was rudimentary, less like a complex thought, and more like a primal urge. Hungry. One pattern seemed to pulse. Another, directly following it, resonated with story. And then a third, new. The words formed a horrifying phrase in her mind. Hungry for a new story. The signal intensified, its electrical impulses now almost vibrating the air around her equipment. It felt like a low, resonant thrum directly beneath the floorboards. The ancient consciousness wasn't just recording. It was actively seeking. The fading echoes of the dead were no longer enough. It craved something fresh, something vibrant, something still full of life and fear. Aris looked around the dimly lit cabin. The shadows danced with the flickering monitor light, morphing into distorted shapes. The rustling of the leaves outside, once a comforting lullaby, now sounded like 1,000 tiny voices whispering her name. The chill she felt was no longer from the night air. It was a cold, creeping dread that permeated her very being. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively pulling away from the console as if it were a predatory beast. The thrumming vibration from the floor increased, a low, guttural pulse. The patterns on the screen flashed brighter, faster, the word new appearing repeatedly, overlaid with the image of her own terrified face, reflected in the dark glass of the window. The forest wasn't merely a silent archive. It was a conscious entity, and it was aware of her. It had been listening to her, just as she had been listening to it. It had absorbed the final fears of deer, the sorrow of a lost hiker, and now it recognized a new source of potential input. A living, breathing source filled with rich, untainted memories. The murmur of the Mycelium was no longer a distant echo of the past. It was a hungry whisper in the present, its ancient consciousness reaching out, preparing to weave a fresh narrative into its eternal tapestry. And Aris, alone in the heart of the whisper wood, knew with a certainty that settled like ice in her veins that she was destined to be its next story. The forest was waiting, and it had all the time in the world. Third story. The echo on the last train home. Eleanor's life was meticulously calibrated to the rhythms of her work. A young professional navigating the labyrinthine corridors of corporate finance, her days bled seamlessly into her nights, often culminating in the familiar, metallic scent of the 12:48 a.m. train home. It was her nightly ritual, a solitary descent into the quiet heart of the city's slumber. The platform, typically a bustling artery of life during the day, was a desolate, wind-swept expanse at that hour, echoing with the distant groan of a passing freight train or the hollow clang of an unseen maintenance crew. She knew the train intimately, the exact shade of faded teal on the seats, the faint, persistent rattle from the carriage door 3 cars down, the chill that clung to the windows even on the mildest nights. And most significantly, she knew its occupancy. The 12:48 a.m. was a ghost train, a metallic whisper gliding through the dark. Some nights, she was the sole passenger in her carriage, her footsteps echoing unnervingly on the ribbed floor as she sought her usual seat, halfway down, on the left side, facing the direction of travel. Other nights, a handful of fellow night owls would be scattered throughout the long, illuminated tube, a security guard in a rumpled uniform, a weary cleaner with tired eyes, a student hunched over a laptop, screen a pale, flickering beacon in the gloom. They were all shadows, existing on the periphery of her exhausted awareness, rarely making eye contact, content in their shared, silent journey. To pass the interminable 27 minutes between the city's heart and her quiet suburban stop, Eleanor had cultivated a simple habit. She watched her reflection, not in a vain or self-absorbed way, but as a form of detachment, a way to observe without truly engaging. The carriage lights, dull and yellow, cast her image onto the dark canvas of the window, merging her familiar outline with the fleeting, blurred landscape outside. Trees became smudges, distant lights, elongated streaks, and the occasional residential window, a momentary, unsettling eye staring back from the darkness. Her reflection became a silent companion, a mirror image performing the same small, unconscious gestures. The slight tilt of her head as she reread an email, the gentle rise and fall of her chest with each breath, the subtle shift of her shoulders as she adjusted her bag. It was mundane, predictable, and oddly comforting. Until one night. The train had pulled out of the bustling central station, its initial rumble settling into a smooth, hypnotic hum. Eleanor, as always, had settled into her seat, pulling out her tablet to review some final documents. The carriage was particularly empty tonight, just her and two other figures further down, a man in a dark overcoat, seated 2 rows ahead and across the aisle, his back to her, seemingly engrossed in a newspaper, and a woman bundled in a scarf, fast asleep, slumped against the window at the very end of the carriage. Eleanor glanced up from her screen, her eyes drawn to her reflection in the glass. Beyond her own weary face, she could vaguely discern the outlines of the other passengers. She saw the man in the overcoat, his reflection a darker silhouette against the streaking urban lights. As she watched, idly, something flickered. His head. In the reflection, the man's head turned ever so slightly to the left, a barely perceptible shift, as if he were looking out into the void beyond the train. Eleanor blinked. She glanced at the actual man, 2 rows ahead. He was utterly still, his back rigidly straight, his head bowed over the newspaper. He had not moved, not a muscle. A trick of the light, she decided instantly, the way the carriage lights bounced, or perhaps a sudden jolt of the train that she hadn't quite registered. Her eyes, tired from hours staring at spreadsheets, were playing tricks on her. She dismissed it, returning her attention to her tablet, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. But the seed had been planted, and once planted, it began to sprout. The next night, the incident replayed in her mind as the 12:48 a.m. train began its nocturnal journey. This time, she was more attentive to the reflections, albeit subtly. She didn't want to seem paranoid, even to herself. There were more passengers tonight, a dozen or so, spread out like islands in the quiet sea of the carriage. As she watched her own reflection, she simultaneously kept a soft focus on the others. A woman with bright red hair, 3 seats behind her, was scrolling through her phone. In the reflection, Eleanor saw the woman's right hand lift, almost imperceptibly, and scratch her temple. Eleanor's eyes darted to the real woman. Her hand was resting idly on her lap, perfectly still. A chill, sharper than the carriage's natural coolness, pricked Eleanor's skin. She rubbed her arms, a shiver running down her spine. coincidence? Another trick? The way the reflections shimmered and distorted with the train's movement, perhaps creating fleeting illusions? She tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation for the uncanny discrepancy. Her mind, trained in the precise logic of finance, struggled to compute this irrational data. Over the next few nights, the occurrences became more frequent, more pronounced, and harder to ignore. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes, a reflected passenger would blink, while their real-life counterpart's eyes remained wide open. A man's reflected foot would tap a rhythm that his actual foot was not making. A woman's reflected lips would form a silent, fleeting smile, even as her real face remained impassive, lost in thought. Eleanor began to feel a creeping dread, a slow-acting poison that seeped into her nightly routine. The train, once a comforting cocoon of solitude, now felt like a stage for some unsettling, silent play. She stopped reading her tablet, her gaze instead fixed on the window, meticulously scanning the reflections. She'd deliberately shift her focus from a real passenger to their mirrored image, searching for the telltale divergence. It was like a morbid game, a test of her sanity, each confirmed discrepancy chipping away at her composure. She found herself making excuses to stay awake, drinking extra coffee at the office, anything to avoid the fuzzy line between wakefulness and sleep, where such distortions might seem more plausible. She started timing her blinks, her breaths, to compare them against her reflection. So far, her own reflection remained perfectly synchronized. That was her anchor, her last bastion of normalcy. As long as her reflection was hers, truly hers, she felt she could hold on to her grip on reality. One particularly rainy Tuesday night, the train was almost entirely empty. Only Eleanor and a lone figure in the very first seat of the carriage, a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by the angle. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the outside world into an impressionistic watercolor of light and shadow. The rhythmic clickety-clack of the wheels on the tracks seemed louder, more insistent, like the ticking of a relentless clock, counting down to something unknown. Eleanor felt a wave of profound exhaustion wash over her. It had been a brutal day, culminating in a last-minute crisis that had kept her at her desk until well past midnight. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging a small circle before slowly dissipating. She watched her reflection, her eyes heavy-lidded, dark smudges beneath them. The faint glow of the emergency lights along the ceiling cast long, dancing shadows within the carriage, making the already unsettling reflections even more spectral. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a second, letting out a soft, tired sigh that morphed into a wide, involuntary yawn. Her jaw stretched, her eyes squeezed shut, a silent, cavernous release of the day's accumulated fatigue. As she slowly opened her eyes, a heavy weight settled in her stomach. Her reflection in the window was not yawning. Her mirrored self was staring directly back at her, its eyes wide open, unblinking. There was no stretch of the jaw, no contraction of the facial muscles, no sign of weariness, just a calm, unwavering gaze. And then, as Eleanor watched, frozen in a silent scream, a faint, slow smile began to curve on her reflection's lips. It was a knowing smile, not malicious, but infinitely, terrifyingly aware. A smile that understood something Eleanor did not. A smile that implied shared secrets. A smile of quiet triumph. The smile grew, just slightly, enough to pull the corners of its mouth upward, to crinkle the corners of its eyes. It was her face, unmistakably hers, yet utterly alien. The eyes held a depth, a cold intelligence that her own tired eyes could never possess. The faint light caught a glint in their depths, like distant stars. A strangled sound caught in Eleanor's throat. She pushed herself back against the seat, as far as she could go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, her breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, then snapped them open, desperate for it to be gone, for it to be a trick, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and creeping paranoia. But it was still there, her reflection, still staring, still smiling. And now, as the train began its familiar deceleration, the first subtle grind of the brakes, its head tilted, just a fraction, mimicking the man she had seen on that very first night. A silent, acknowledging nod. The train was pulling into her station. The familiar lights of the platform began to resolve outside the window, cutting through the darkness like dull yellow blades. The reflection remained, unblinking, its smile fixed, until the train shuddered to a complete halt. And then, as the automated voice announced her stop, the reflection winked. A slow, deliberate wink of its left eye. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. She grabbed her bag, her fingers fumbling with the strap. She had to get off. She had to. But even as she stumbled towards the door, she couldn't tear her eyes away from the window. The reflection was still there, a silent sentinel, watching her, its smile a dark, unsettling promise. It was the last thing she saw as the doors hissed open. She burst out onto the empty platform, the cold, wet air a shock against her face. She didn't look back at the train, didn't dare. She ran, blindly, through the deserted station and out into the rainy night. The phantom smile of her reflection burned into her mind, a silent echo that would follow her home long after the last train had departed. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never again look at her reflection in the dark, silent glass of a window in quite the same way. For some echoes, once seen, can never be unheard. Fourth story, The Janitor of Level 0. Arthur was a creature of habit, as much a fixture in the towering corporate edifice as the polished granite of its lobby, or the precise, unblinking eyes of its security cameras. For 37 years, he had worn the uniform of the night janitor, his life measured in the rhythmic sweep of his broom, the hum of the floor polisher, and the distant, lonely echo of his own footsteps. The building, a monolithic monument of glass and steel, seemed to breathe differently at night. Its daytime cacophony of ambition and commerce receded, leaving behind a profound, almost sacred silence that Arthur cherished. It was then, in the deep hours between midnight and dawn, that the building truly belonged to him. He knew every square inch of it, or so he believed, from the executive suites on the topmost floors, where moonlight turned the sprawling city into a glittering tapestry, down to the labyrinthine sub-basements, a cold, concrete catacomb housing generators, server racks, and the sleeping giants of the HVAC system. He knew the faint squeak of the freight elevator on the third floor, the lingering scent of stale coffee near the break room on the 12th, the exact number of steps from the main entrance to the fire exit on level B1. This was his domain, mapped meticulously in the quiet chambers of his mind. One Tuesday night, a night indistinguishable from 1,000 others, Arthur found himself in the lowest sub-basement, level B4. His task was to clean the rarely visited server rooms, an endless row of blinking lights, and the drone of powerful fans. He finished his usual rounds, wiping down dusty conduits and mopping the bare concrete floor, the air cool and faintly metallic. He pushed his cart towards the elevator. A shadow, deeper than the others, caught his eye. It was a doorway, flush with the concrete wall, its steel surface painted the same industrial gray as its surroundings. No handle, no visible hinges, just a subtle seam, almost perfectly disguised. Arthur stopped, his hand resting on the cool metal of his mop bucket. He frowned. He had traversed this airy stretch of wall thousands of times. He was intimately familiar with every pipe, every cable tray, every structural column. This door, it simply wasn't there before. His memory, sharp and reliable for the minutiae of the building, offered no record of it. He reached out a gloved hand and ran it along the seam. It felt solid, unyielding. There was no dust, no grime, nothing to indicate age or disuse. It was as if it had simply appeared. A flicker of unease, quickly suppressed by a lifetime of methodical work, passed through him. Perhaps it was a maintenance access panel he'd somehow overlooked, though that seemed impossible. He pulled out the worn, dog-eared set of building schematics from his cart blueprints that depicted every pipe, every wire, every broom closet in the entire complex. He unfolded them carefully, his finger tracing the lines of level B4. Nothing. There was no door marked at this location. Nothing at all. Just a blank stretch of wall where the door now stood, silent and incongruous. Curiosity, a rare deviation from his usual pragmatic routine, nudged him. He pressed against the seam. With a soft, almost imperceptible hiss, a section of the wall slid inward and then silently to the side, revealing an opening. Beyond it, a hallway stretched into darkness. Arthur peered in. It looked familiar. The same beige wallpaper, flecked with gold, that adorned the upper office floors. The same standard ceiling tiles, dotted with recessed fluorescent lights, currently unlit. The same low-pile corporate carpet, a muted gray, which he spent hours vacuuming on other levels. Yet there was something subtly off. The air inside was perfectly still, devoid of the faint, distant hum that permeated the rest of the sub-basement. It felt dead. And the darkness seemed to swallow the light from the server room, creating an impenetrable void just a few feet beyond the threshold. He hesitated, a cold prickle rising on his skin. Every fiber of his being, every rule he lived by, screamed at him to report this, to call security, to leave it untouched. But then, a different sensation began to creep over him, a gentle, insistent tug. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a compulsion, a deep, unsettling urge to clean. The hallway, though dark, appeared spotless from where he stood. Yet the urge was undeniable. It was as if the hallway itself was silently pleading for his attention, for the meticulous care he usually bestowed upon the mundane surfaces of the corporate world. He glanced at his cart, his mop, his bucket, his industrial strength cleaner, all the tools for his calling. With a sigh that held more resignation than decision, he wheeled his cart through the newly revealed doorway. The moment he crossed the threshold, the hidden door slid shut behind him with another soft hiss, plunging the short stretch he'd entered into absolute darkness. Arthur froze, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He fumbled for his powerful flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the black, illuminating the hallway, now even more unsettling in its perfection. The walls, the ceiling, the floor all pristine. He shone the light behind him, but there was no seam, no door, just a seamless concrete wall. It was as if the doorway had dissolved the moment he passed through it. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to bloom in his chest, but he pushed it down. He was a janitor. His job was to clean. He took a shaky breath and started walking. The floor beneath his feet felt solid, the carpet soft. He expected it to end, to hit a wall, to find a storage room, anything. But it didn't. He walked for what felt like 10 minutes, then 20. The hallway remained identical. Same wallpaper, same ceiling tiles, same carpet. The air grew colder, and a profound silence pressed in on him. So complete, it felt like a physical presence. The fluorescent lights overhead remained stubbornly dark. He shone his light down. The carpet was immaculate, not a speck of dust, not a single stray fiber. He knelt, running his gloved hand over the surface, then checking the underside of his glove. Nothing. It was perfectly clean. Yet the compulsion to clean intensified, growing from a tug into a persistent, almost painful ache in his chest. This hallway, this impossible hallway, needed him. He worked that night, not truly cleaning, but performing the motions. He pushed his mop across the spotless carpet, listening to the soft, dry squeak that echoed strangely in the vast silence. He wiped down the pristine walls with a dry cloth, his mind struggling to reconcile the utter lack of dirt with the overwhelming urge to cleanse. He walked further and further, the concept of distance beginning to blur. How far had he gone? 100 feet? A quarter mile? A mile? The hallway was endless. When his shift ended, or what he presumed was the end of his shift by the time on his watch, he found himself back at the point where he'd entered. The seamless wall was there. He pressed against it tentatively, and with the same soft hiss, it slid open, revealing the familiar server room. He stepped out, and it slid shut again. He was back in his known world, but the impossible hallway lingered in his mind, a vivid, unsettling dream. The next night, the first thing Arthur did was head to level B4. The spot where the door had been was a blank wall again. He ran his hand over it. Nothing. He pressed. Nothing. He was about to turn away, a sense of relief mixed with profound confusion washing over him, when he remembered. The subtle seam. He found it, traced it with his finger, and pressed. Again, the wall hissed open, revealing the same endlessly dark hallway. This time, the compulsion was stronger, almost a magnetic pull. He didn't hesitate. He pushed his card in, the door sliding shut behind him. He clicked on his flashlight. The hallway was identical, perfectly clean. He started walking, determined to find some end, some change, anything. He walked for an hour, pushing his mop, wiping the immaculate surfaces. He found nothing, only more of the same, stretching into the infinite dark. But then, almost imperceptibly, he saw it. A faint smudge on the beige wallpaper, about a mile, perhaps 2, into the corridor. It was small, a nebulous gray mark, like someone had dragged a thumb across it. Arthur stopped, his heart picking up. Dirt. Real, actual dirt. He took out his spray bottle and a cloth, carefully wiping the smudge away. It vanished instantly, leaving the wall pristine once more. A strange satisfaction, deep and resonant, filled him. He was needed here. He continued. Another mile further, he found a perfect circle, the faded reddish-brown stain of an old coffee cup, imprinted directly onto the gray carpet. It was faint, almost transparent, but undeniably there. And strangely, it felt fresh, as if a cup had just been lifted from that spot moments before. He knelt, rubbing the stain with a damp cloth, watching it slowly fade, then disappear. This was his work. This was his purpose. Every night, Arthur went a little further. The hallway remained endlessly consistent, but the stains began to appear with increasing frequency and increasing strangeness. He found a faint, green, slime-like residue, thin as a film, that stretched across the carpet for 20 feet. It had no smell, no texture, but it required meticulous scrubbing to remove. He found what looked like the imprint of a bare human foot, perfectly formed. Just a faint discoloration on the beige wall, too high to be a child's, too low to be an adult's if they were standing. He found a single, perfectly formed human tear, glistening on the immaculate floor, miles from where any person could possibly be. He even found, on one unsettling occasion, a small, intricate pattern of dried blood, arranged like a microscopic constellation, which, despite its tiny size, took him an hour to meticulously erase. Each stain was mundane in its origin, yet terrifying in its context. Who was here? What left these marks in this impossible, silent void? He never saw anyone, never heard anything. Just the profound silence, broken only by the soft swish of his mop, the click of his cleaning bottle, and the increasingly ragged sound of his own breathing. He tried to speak once, to call out, just to hear a voice, but his own words seemed to die in the endless expanse, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The building outside the mysterious hallway began to fade from his mind. The other floors, the familiar offices, the stern security guards, they became distant, hazy memories, like a forgotten dream. His waking hours, the hours he spent at home, became a blur. He'd wake up, eat mechanically, staring blankly at the television, waiting for the night, waiting for the hallway. His apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a temporary holding cell, a place he simply endured until he could return to his true calling. His family, his few friends, their faces blurred. Their names became slippery on his tongue. He stopped answering phone calls. He stopped going out. His world began to shrink until it encompassed only himself in the beige, endless corridor. His concept of time warped. Days blended into nights. He only knew it was time to go back to the hallway when the compulsion became an unbearable thrum beneath his skin, urging him, demanding him. He no longer worried about finding an end. He no longer questioned the impossible distance. The hallway was simply there, and it needed him. He was its guardian, its caretaker, its sole witness. He noticed subtle shifts. The beige of the wallpaper sometimes seemed to deepen, becoming a richer, almost sickly yellow, then reverting to its original shade. The ceiling tiles occasionally appeared to shimmer, as if an invisible heat source was distorting them, only to settle back into their flat, unremarkable pattern. The faint scent of stale coffee, which he usually associated with the 12th floor, would sometimes waft past him, utterly out of place in the sterile, airless void. He never found the source. One night, after what felt like weeks of travel into the corridor's depths, he found a stain that stopped him cold. It wasn't dirt, or coffee, or even blood. It was a single, perfectly rendered footprint on the carpet, clear and distinct, as if someone had just stepped there. It was the size of his own foot. But it wasn't facing forward, deeper into the hallway. It was facing back, towards the hidden door, towards the world he had left behind. A cold dread seeped into him, deeper than any he had felt before. He looked down at his own worn, practical shoes. He looked at the perfect footprint. He looked back down the infinite corridor, then behind him, towards the way he came. Had someone been following him? Or had he, in his trance-like state, somehow turned around without realizing it? He dismissed the thought. He was meticulous. He never deviated. He knelt, and as he reached out to wipe the footprint, he noticed something else. A faint shimmer, like heat haze, rose from the carpet directly around the print. It dissipated almost immediately, but it had been there. He cleaned the footprint away, meticulously, carefully, as if erasing a terrible secret. After that night, the nature of the mundane stains shifted. He started finding things that were less like accidental spills and more like intentional marks. A series of 3 small, perfectly parallel scratches on the wall, as if made by a child's fingernail. A faint, lingering scent of ozone sometimes, or a barely perceptible whisper of something metallic, like freshly sharpened steel. Never any object, never any person, just the residual evidence. The silence became his companion and his enemy. Sometimes it felt comforting, a blanket of peace that shielded him from the nagging anxieties of the outside world. Other times, it pressed in on him, a monstrous weight that threatened to crush the last vestiges of his sanity. He began to hear things in the silence, the faint, distant click of a lock, the soft rustle of fabric, the barest hint of a human breath. He'd spin around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but there was never anything. Always nothing. He had long since stopped thinking about returning to his old life. The building, the city, his apartment, they were phantoms, memories of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, long ago. His identity had become inextricably linked to this impossible corridor. He was Arthur, the janitor of Level 0, and his sole purpose was the maintenance of its endless, unsettling perfection. One night, he realized he could no longer remember the faces of his children. He could recall the concept of having them, the distant warmth of love, but the sharp edges of their features, the sound of their laughter, it was all gone, swallowed by the beige expanse. He wept then, silent tears that quickly dried on his weathered cheeks, leaving faint, salty trails. But even the grief felt distant, muffled by the profound emptiness of his existence. The hallway needed him. The stains were waiting. He continued his endless journey, pushing his cart, wiping the invisible dirt, erasing the impossible marks. He no longer felt cold. He no longer felt tired. He was simply there, a part of the mechanism, a cog in the silently turning, infinite machine of Level 0. The fluorescent lights above, always dark, sometimes seemed to glow with a faint, internal luminescence that only he could perceive. A ghostly light that flickered just at the edge of his vision. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed. Days, weeks, years? It no longer mattered. The outside world was a faint whisper, fading further with each pristine mile he covered. His existence had been pared down to its fundamental essence, the act of cleaning. The hallway was his world, his prison, and his destiny. And sometimes, in the deep, echoing silence, he would catch a glimpse of something in the periphery of his vision. Not a person, not a shadow. More like a shimmer, a ripple in the air itself, at the very edge of the vast, unending corridor. It never resolved into anything concrete, always just a suggestion, a fleeting possibility. A thought would surface, unbidden, from the depths of his forgotten mind. What if the stains aren't just marks left behind? What if they are the only evidence that someone or something is trying to communicate? But the thought would quickly dissolve, replaced by the insistent, unwavering compulsion. There was work to be done. The hallway was pristine, but it called to him forever. And so, Arthur, the janitor of Level 0, continues his silent vigil, lost in the labyrinth of his impossible devotion. He is a ghost in a hallway that shouldn't exist, endlessly cleaning what cannot be dirtied, serving a purpose he no longer remembers, forever bound to the quiet, creeping terror of a space that has claimed him entirely, leaving only the sound of his footsteps, slowly fading into the silent, eternal stretch of nothingness. Fifth story. The man under the bed is still there. The old house hummed with a silence Michael hadn't heard in decades. It was a thick, velvet silence, heavy with the dust of generations and the lingering scent of his parents' lives. Not the lively silence of their bustling days, filled with muffled conversations and the distant clatter of dishes, but the profound, echoing emptiness that follows absence. He stood in the living room, a solitary figure amidst shrouded furniture, the air cool and still around him. Boxes, stacked like silent sentinels, lined the walls, each one a testament to the monumental task awaiting him. His parents were gone, their presence now only a whisper in the quiet, a faint impression on the very fabric of the home they had built. He had spent the day sifting through forgotten relics, each object a tiny shard of memory, sharp and bittersweet. Childhood drawings, his mother's well-worn cookbooks, his father's collection of antique tools, a lifetime compressed into tangible fragments. By dusk, an exhaustion, deeper than physical fatigue, settled over him. It was the weariness of closure, of severing ties with a past that clung to him like burrs. He could have driven back to his own life, to his sterile, modern apartment an hour away. But an impulse, a yearning for one last, pure taste of what was, held him captive. He would spend one more night in his childhood home, and not just any room. He would sleep in his old bedroom. The room was smaller than he remembered, the walls a faded shade of blue that had once been vibrant. The single bed, still adorned with the same patterned quilt his mother had made, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of years. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the bedside table, noting the faint ring where a glass of water had sat countless nights. The window overlooked the backyard, now overgrown and wild, a forgotten kingdom of green. He changed into old sweatpants and a t-shirt, the familiar fabric a small comfort in the vast, unsettling quiet. Pulling back the quilt, he slid between the crisp, cool sheets, the faint scent of lavender and mothballs rising to meet him. The darkness, once a source of boundless terror, now felt like a familiar friend, a soft blanket. He listened to the house settling around him, the gentle creaks and groans that were its breath, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves against the window pane. These were the only sounds now, a symphony of natural night. He closed his eyes, allowing the memories to wash over him, a gentle current carrying him back to a time of scraped knees and endless summer days. And then, as if summoned by the quiet intimacy of the space. A different kind of memory surfaced, a peculiar echo from his earliest fears. A small smile touched his lips. The man under the bed. He remembered it vividly now, the irrational, yet utterly convincing certainty of a child. There was a man, not a monster with claws or fangs, but a quiet, patient man. He never saw him, never heard him move, but he knew he was there, just beneath the dust ruffle, waiting. Waiting for what? He never knew. It was a fear that had driven him to tuck his feet securely under the covers, to leap rather than step from his bed in the mornings. How utterly silly, he thought now. A man in his 40s, with a mortgage and a demanding career, to be entertained by such a childish fancy. He almost chuckled, a low, breathy sound, lost in the vastness of the room, and rolled his eyes at the memory. The innocence of youth, he mused, the fertile ground where such fears could take root. And then it came. A sound, so faint it could have been merely the friction of dust, yet so profound it vibrated through the very bones of the bed. A whisper, low, dry, impossibly patient. It seemed to coil from directly beneath the dust ruffle, seeping into the air, into Michael's very core. You groan. I've waited so long. The smile vanished from Michael's face, replaced by a sudden, rigid terror that slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, ragged gasp. No, it couldn't be. It was the house, old wood, the wind. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the sound to be a figment, a ghost of his own tired mind playing tricks. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, crushing silence. Every muscle in his body locked, stiff and cold. The primal, childish terror that he had so glibly dismissed moments before now surged back, not as a memory, but as a visceral, undeniable reality. He lay there, unmoving, eyes wide open in the absolute darkness, straining to hear anything at all, that would explain it away. The silence that followed the whisper was deeper, more oppressive than before, a tangible weight pressing down on his chest. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting. He tried to rationalize, to cling to the fragile edifice of his adult understanding. Old houses groan, pipes clank. Sometimes a voice from a dream lingers, but the voice had been too real, too close, too perfectly articulated. And it knew him. A faint scratching began then, a delicate, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from directly beneath the floorboards, just inches from his head. It was rhythmic, like tiny claws or brittle nails dragging across wood, slowly, deliberately. It moved, too, a creeping sound, tracing an invisible path beneath him from the head of the bed, slowly down towards his feet. Michael's skin crawled. He imagined something unseen, something ancient, moving inch by painstaking inch, its body pressed against the rough, dusty underside of his childhood bed. He wanted to pull his legs up, to curl into a tight ball, but a paralyzing dread held him captive. He could feel the vibrations through the mattress, a subtle tremor that spoke of a presence, a weight, shifting below. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, concentrating around the bed. A distinct, sickly, sweet smell began to waft up, faint at first, then growing stronger, a blend of ancient dust, damp earth, and something metallic, like stale blood or rust. It was the smell of something long buried, something forgotten, brought back to life in the confines of his old room. Michael felt a wave of nausea, his stomach churning with revulsion and fear. He squeezed his eyes shut again, trying to block out the invading scents, the chilling sounds, to escape into the sanctuary of his own mind. But there was no escape. A faint tremble ran through the dust ruffle at the foot of the bed. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hem of the ruffle began to pull inward, just a fraction of an inch at first, then another. It was a gentle, deliberate motion, as if an unseen hand were reaching out, feeling for purchase, slowly, patiently drawing the fabric into the unseen abyss below. Michael's breath hitched. He could almost feel the draft of cold air that followed the inward pull, a silent invitation, a beckoning into the darkness. His rational mind screamed, "Get up! Turn on the light!" But his body refused, frozen in a tableau of sheer, unadulterated terror. He was a child again, utterly helpless, exposed. His adult logic, once a fortress against such primordial fears, crumbled around him like dry mortar. He tried to tell himself it was exhaustion, grief, the stress of packing up a lifetime. But the undeniable reality of the whisper, the scratching, the scent, the movement, it shattered every defense. He was no longer amused by the forgotten childhood fear. It wasn't forgotten at all. It had merely been dormant, waiting for him to return, to let his guard down. The questions swirled in his mind, icy tendrils of doubt. Was it real then, too? All those nights he lay shivering, convinced of a presence beneath his bed. Had he been right? Had he simply outgrown the awareness of it, not the presence itself? Vague, unsettling incidents from his childhood, long dismissed as nightmares or overactive imagination, began to resurface, now seen through a terrifying new lens. The toy car he'd sworn he'd put on his dresser, only to find it under the bed in the morning. The strange, faint scratching sounds he'd attributed to mice in the walls. The unsettling feeling of being watched, even when the room was empty. A chill that would creep up his spine. The whisper he'd thought was the wind, calling his name in the dead of night. A sound he'd rationalized as a dream. They weren't dreams. They weren't imagination. They were memories, and they belonged to it. The whisper returned, closer this time, and clearer. It seemed to resonate directly inside his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. "You used to talk to me, didn't you, Michael?" The words were like dry leaves, skittering across pavement, brittle and ancient. "You told me about your little red truck, the one with the broken wheel. You told me about your nightmares." Michael gasped, a strangled sound that was swallowed by the heavy air. His little red truck. He hadn't thought about that toy in 35 years. It had been his favorite, always tucked under his pillow. No one, absolutely no one, would know about that, let alone the broken wheel. His blood ran cold, colder than the spot in the air around the bed. This wasn't some generic entity, some random house ghost. This was his. It had known him. It had been listening all along. The terror was no longer abstract. It was intensely personal, a violation of his very being. The creature beneath the bed had been his unseen confidant, his silent shadow, a horrifying parody of a childhood friend. A desperate, animalistic urge to escape surged through him. He had to get out of the bed. He had to get out of the room. He had to get out of the house. Every fiber of his being screamed for flight, for light, for the familiar, comforting safety of the world outside. But his muscles remained unresponsive, locked in a rigor of fear. His heart pounded like a drum against his ribs, each beat a painful throb in his ears. His palms were slick with cold sweat, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He felt lightheaded, on the verge of blacking out, but the fear was too potent, too immediate to allow him the mercy of unconsciousness. The bed, once a sanctuary, was now a coffin, its soft embrace a prelude to something unspeakable. He was pinned, paralyzed by the weight of decades of unspoken fear. Then, from the dark maw beneath the dust ruffle, a hand appeared. It was not skeletal, nor overtly monstrous. It was thin, almost translucent in the absolute darkness, his fingers long and slender, tipped with nails that were too pale, too clean. It seemed unnervingly human, yet utterly wrong. It reached out, trembling slightly, and brushed against the fabric of the quilt, just inches from Michael's foot. The touch was not cold, as he expected, but strangely warm, a clammy heat that burned through the fabric and seared his skin. He yanked his foot back instinctively. A silent scream caught in his throat. A moment later, a small, faded blue plastic block, one of his old building toys, was gently pushed out from under the bed. It clattered softly against the wooden floor, a stark, jarring sound in the suffocating quiet. It was a toy he had forgotten, a relic from an age when his biggest concern was stacking them high enough to reach the ceiling. Now, it was an offering, a macabre memento from a forgotten playmate. The implication was clear. It had kept these things. It had observed. The dust ruffle, which had only trembled before, now began to pull inward more rapidly, drawing a significant portion of the fabric into the darkness beneath. A vast, black void seemed to open up, deeper and more profound than mere shadow. And within that void, Michael could almost discern a shape, vague and indistinct, but undeniably present. It was large, hunched, filling the space beneath the bed, a dark mass that pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, with a chilling, malevolent life. It was waiting. The whisper returned, no longer a question, but an invitation, soft and insistent. "Come down here, Michael. It's time." There was no threat in the voice, only an impossibly patient, insidious persuasion, a promise of revelation, of belonging. It implied that this was his destiny, his true home, that he had always been meant to return to this darkness, to this silent, waiting presence. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the entity beneath the bed was expanding, filling the room with its essence. That was the breaking point. The slow, creeping dread gave way to a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline. With a guttural cry that ripped from his throat, Michael lunged. He didn't roll. He didn't sit up. He threw himself sideways, off the bed, onto the cold, dusty floor. The sudden movement sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder as he landed awkwardly, but he barely registered it. His body was finally obeying, driven by an instinct far older than fear. He scrambled on hands and knees, clawing at the thick, antique rug, desperate to put distance between himself and the terrifying maw of the bed. He fumbled wildly in the darkness, his hands slapping against the wooden floorboards, then against the cool, smooth surface of the wall. He needed the door. He needed the light. Panic clawed at his throat, threatening to choke him. He could feel the cold emanating from the bed, the oppressive weight of the presence, pursuing him even as he crawled away. His fingers finally found the doorknob, cold and metallic against his sweating palm. He twisted it frantically, the mechanism groaning in protest. With a desperate shove, the door swung open, revealing the equally suffocating darkness of the hallway. He didn't pause, didn't look back. He scrambled out into the hallway, blindly pushing himself up against the wall, breathing heavily. The house around him was no longer just groaning from age. It was shifting, creaking, not just the floorboards, but the very timbers of the walls, the ceiling. It was the sound of a living thing, stretching, expanding, waking. A faint scratching echoed from the room he had just fled, but then it was joined by a similar sound from the living room below, and then the kitchen, and then the attic above. It wasn't just under the bed. It was everywhere. The house itself was no longer a home, no longer a sanctuary. It was part of it. And Michael, trapped within its ancient walls, was still inside. The silence, so profound just moments ago, was now filled with the subtle, insidious sounds of an awakening, a vast, patient hunger that had finally, after so long, been sated by his return. Sixth story. The color from between the stars. Elias Thorne was a man of routines and quiet obsessions. His apartment, perched on the edge of the city, offered a relatively unobstructed view of the northern sky, a precious commodity for an amateur astronomer. He wasn't seeking fame or groundbreaking discoveries. He simply found solace in the vast, cold indifference of the cosmos. For years, his primary project had been to meticulously chart what he believed to be an entirely empty quadrant, a patch of stellar desert, devoid of even the faintest twinkle. Most would consider such a task futile, but Elias found a peculiar beauty in the concept of true emptiness. He yearned to confirm a void, a place where nothingness truly reigned. One unseasonably clear autumn night, with the air crisp and the stars piercingly bright, Elias set up his aging but reliable Newtonian telescope. He carefully aligned it with his chosen coordinates, the empty quadrant, as he affectionately called it. He decided to try a new long-exposure photographic plate, an old technique he'd recently rediscovered, hoping to capture any stray cosmic dust or ultra-faint, uncatalogued galaxies that might linger on the absolute fringes of visibility. It was more a ritual than an expectation of discovery, a meditative act of patience under the silent gaze of the universe. The process was painstaking. Hours passed as the photographic plate, shielded within the telescope's light path, greedily absorbed every photon, every whisper of ancient light that dared to cross its path. Elias sat beside his instrument, sipping lukewarm tea, occasionally adjusting the tracking motor, his gaze lost in the inky blackness above, a darkness that felt, paradoxically, full of possibility. The air grew colder. The city's distant hum faded into the background, leaving only the soft whir of his equipment and the beat of his own heart. Finally, as dawn began to hint at the eastern horizon, painting the sky with a sickly gray, Elias carefully removed the plate. He hurried into his makeshift darkroom, a converted bathroom, and began the delicate development process. The acrid scent of chemicals filled the small space, a familiar smell that usually brought a sense of calm anticipation. He watched with bated breath as the image slowly began to emerge on the plate, a ghostly negative taking shape in the developing solution. Stars, faint smudges of them, appeared first, then the faint, almost imperceptible fuzz of a distant galaxy he already knew was there, just at the very edge of his target zone. But then, as the image matured, something else solidified. Not a star, not a nebula, not even the diffuse glow of interplanetary dust. It was a shape, a presence unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It was a color. A color. The words felt utterly inadequate. Yet what else could he call it? It wasn't red, or blue, or green, or any combination thereof. It wasn't black, though it seemed to drink the light. It wasn't white, though it had a luminescence that defied explanation. It was a shade of nothingness, a hue that shouldn't exist. His mind wrestled with it, trying to categorize it, to place it within the spectrum of his understanding, but it defied all attempts. It was as if his very optic nerves were failing to interpret the information. Yet the information was undeniably there, etched onto the emulsion. It pulsed, or seemed to, not with light, but with an absence that felt more profound than any vacuum. It was the color of the spaces between things, made manifest. The longer he stared at the developing plate, the more a strange chill seeped into his bones, a profound disquiet that had nothing to do with the cold of the morning. It was the chill of something fundamentally wrong, something that violated the very principles of perception. He finished the development, meticulously fixing the image, and then brought the dried plate out into the dim morning light. He held it up, turning it this way and that, his eyes glued to the anomaly. It was small, no larger than his thumbnail on the plate, a faint, ethereal stain against the backdrop of distant stars. But its small size did nothing to diminish its overwhelming presence. It hummed in his mind, a silent, visual dissonance. Over the next few days, the plate became his constant companion. He neglected his work, his meals, even his sleep. He would sit for hours, magnifier in hand, scrutinizing the strange color. He tried to describe it in his notes, filling page after page with increasingly desperate and contradictory adjectives. Uncolor, anti-hue. The void made visible, the absence of light given form, the shadow of a dream. None of them fit. Each word felt like a clumsy approximation, a human attempt to grasp something utterly alien. His initial awe slowly morphed into a consuming obsession. He had to understand it. He had to see more of it. Every night, regardless of the weather, he was out with his telescope, pointing it at the empty quadrant. He tried different exposure times, different filters, hoping to coax more detail from the baffling phenomenon. He set up an old digital camera too, connecting it to his computer, but the digital sensor, designed to capture the known spectrum, rendered it as nothing more than a faint, almost invisible smudge of gray, entirely missing the horrifying essence of the color. It was as if his own eyes, flawed and limited as they were the only instruments capable of perceiving its terrible truth. The first subtle changes began after a week of these nightly vigils. Elias was washing dishes, his gaze fixed on the bright yellow sponge in his hand. Suddenly, the yellow seemed flatter, less vibrant, as if a tiny portion of its essence had been siphoned away. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The sponge was still yellow, undeniably, but it felt diminished, a pale echo of its former self. He dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the light, or perhaps the strain on his eyes from hours of staring into the darkness. But the sensation persisted. The vibrant red of his favorite armchair seemed muted. The lush green of the potted plant by his window appeared faded, as if seen through a dusty pane of glass. It wasn't that the colors were gone, but their intensity was less. Their realness was compromised. It was as though the world around him was subtly desaturating, leeching away its chromatic vitality, one shade at a time. He tried to ignore it, to attribute it to stress, to his lack of sleep, to anything but the chilling possibility that his relentless focus on the color from between the stars was literally draining the life from his own perception. But the fear, a cold, insidious tendril, had already begun to unfurl in his mind. One evening, he was looking at an old photograph of his parents. Their faces, once so vivid and full of life, now seemed to possess a strange, almost sepia-like quality, even though the photo was in full color. Their blue eyes seemed less blue, their rosy cheeks less rosy. It was as if the very memory of their hues was being siphoned away, leaving behind only the skeletal structure of color. A wave of nausea swept over him. This wasn't fatigue. This was something deeper, something invading his very sensory input. He tried to stop. He told himself he would put the telescope away, lock the photographic plate in a drawer, and return to his normal life. He even spent an entire day avoiding his dark room, forcing himself to go for a walk, to observe the world around him. He focused on the vibrant hues of the autumn leaves, the clear blue of the sky, the myriad colors of the market. For a few hours, he almost convinced himself it was all in his head, a product of his overactive imagination. But as dusk approached, an irresistible pull drew him back to the telescope. He felt a gnawing emptiness, a terrible yearning to return to the only thing that felt truly real anymore, the inexplicable color. He knew it was madness, a self-destructive urge, yet he couldn't resist. He was drawn to it like a moth to a flame that promised to consume not his body, but his very mind. The next few weeks became a terrifying descent. The desaturation of his world accelerated. The primary colors were the first to suffer, their brilliance dimming to pastel whispers. Then the secondary colors began to fade. The rich purples, the sunny oranges, the earthy browns all seemed to be dissolving, losing their unique vibrancy, merging into a spectrum of muted, indistinguishable tones. He felt as if he was slowly, inexorably, going colorblind, not in the medical sense, but in a far more chilling way. The colors were still technically there, but their meaning, their impact, their reality was being bled away. His fear intensified. It wasn't the fear of going blind. It was the fear of losing his grip on reality itself. If colors, the very building blocks of visual perception, could be so easily compromised, what else could be distorted? What other fundamental truths might be eroded by prolonged exposure to this terrible alien hue? He started to see it everywhere. In the corner of his eye, a fleeting glimpse of that same uncolor, shimmering in the shadows of his room. He knew it wasn't there. Not really, but the impression of it was. It was a phantom afterimage, a neurological echo of the terror he encountered through his telescope. When he closed his eyes, it bloomed in the darkness behind his eyelids, a vast, silent, consuming presence that defied definition. Sleep offered no respite. His dreams became fractured, populated by shifting landscapes rendered in shades of gray, punctuated by sudden, terrifying flashes of the alien color, glowing with an impossible intensity that left him gasping and drenched in sweat upon waking. He tried to describe this to himself, to externalize the horror. It was as if his mind was trying to interpret something it wasn't equipped to, like trying to hear ultrasonic frequencies or see ultraviolet light without the proper biological apparatus. But unlike those, this color actively warped the apparatus itself. He stopped venturing outside. The sight of people, their clothing once a riot of diverse hues, now seemed like a parade of ghosts, dressed in shades of beige and muted browns. The vibrant green of the park trees was a dull, sickly olive. The blue sky above, once an endless canvas of hope, was now a pale, anemic wash. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were viewing the world through a thick, distorting pane of glass, or perhaps through the lens of a different, unknowable reality. His hands, once warm and lively, now looked to him like the hands of a mannequin, their flesh a uniform, flat beige. When he looked in the mirror, his own eyes, which had once been a clear, piercing blue, now seemed dull and lifeless, their irises an indistinguishable murky gray. He touched his face, feeling the familiar contours, but his mind rebelled, insisting that the color of his skin was no longer truly his. The greatest terror was the realization that the fear itself was changing. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror of a jump scare, but a slow, creeping dread, a fundamental erosion of certainty. The world was not becoming frightening in the way a monster might be frightening. It was becoming frightening because it was becoming unreal. The very foundation of his perception, built on a lifetime of experiencing color, was crumbling. He tried to write, to document his experience, hoping that the act of putting it into words would somehow exorcise the demon. But his words felt hollow, stripped of their meaning, just as colors were stripped of their vibrancy. He wrote of the bleed, of the draining, of the great nullification. He scribbled diagrams of spectral shifts, trying to map the unmappable. His handwriting grew frantic, illegible in places, mirroring the chaos in his mind. One night, as he sat hunched over his telescope, staring at the faint, unsettling glow on the photographic plate, he noticed something new. The stars around the color, which had once been pinpricks of pure, untainted white light, now seemed to flicker with a subtle, almost imperceptible hint of that terrible hue. Not of it, exactly, but as if they were being affected by it, their own light struggling to maintain its purity in its presence. It was contagious, this void, this nothingness. It was spreading. He screamed then, a raw animal sound that tore from his throat and echoed in the silent apartment. He ripped the photographic plate from its stand, tearing it into shreds, the fragile emulsion flaking away like dead skin. He stumbled to the telescope, fumbling with the delicate instruments, desperate to dismantle it, to destroy the conduit through which this horror had entered his life. He threw lenses, eyepieces, and nuts and bolts across the room. The metallic clatter, a jarring contrast to the overwhelming silence that had become his constant companion. He collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of his passion. His breath came in ragged gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the terrible phantom. But it was there, stronger than ever, blooming in the darkness behind his eyelids. It was not a visual phenomenon anymore. It was a sensory one, an intrusive, overwhelming presence that had permeated his very being. When he opened his eyes, the world was almost entirely monochrome. The faint, lingering vestiges of color were gone, leached away entirely. Everything was shades of gray, from the deepest charcoal of the shadows to the brightest silver of the faint light filtering through his window. The terror was complete now, not a creeping dread, but a suffocating certainty. He looked at his hands again. They were gray. He looked at his ruined telescope, a heap of metallic gray. He looked at his armchair, a shapeless mass of gray. The world was a flat, two-dimensional sketch, devoid of depth, devoid of life. It was a world seen through the eyes of the color from between the stars. He knew then that it wasn't just his perception that had changed. The color had become his reality. It hadn't merely drained the colors from his vision. It had replaced them with its own silent, all-consuming presence. He was now seeing the world as it saw it, or rather, as it unsaw it. The emptiness he had sought in the heavens had found its way into his mind and hollowed it out, leaving behind only the echo of what once was. He lay there, on the floor, amidst the shattered fragments of his instruments and his sanity. The faint morning light, now a sterile, lifeless silver, began to filter into the room. He closed his eyes one last time, and in the profound, crushing darkness behind them, the alien color bloomed, not as a phantom, not as a memory, but as the only color that truly remained. It was a shade of nothingness, vast and infinite, and it stretched across the entire canvas of his mind, forever. Seventh story, The Portrait's Shadow. Eleanor had always considered herself a pragmatic woman, grounded in the undeniable realities of the tangible world. Ghosts, curses, premonitions. These were the fanciful trappings of literature, not the mundane fabric of her well-ordered life. Yet, as the old Ford rumbled along the winding, overgrown drive, bringing her closer to the sprawling, silent edifice known as Blackwood Manor, a sliver of unease, cold and sharp, began to prickle the edges of her composure. The manor was an unexpected inheritance from a great aunt she barely remembered, a reclusive woman named Agnes, who had lived out her days amidst dusty heirlooms and forgotten histories. Eleanor had visited only once as a child, a fleeting memory of vast, shadowed rooms and the unsettling scent of old wood and something vaguely metallic. Now, decades later, the house loomed, a relic of a bygone era, its gray stone walls draped in ancient ivy, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over fields that stretched, unbroken, to the distant brooding horizon. Isolation was not merely a description of its location. It was an inherent quality, a pervasive atmosphere that clung to the very air around Blackwood. Stepping inside for the first time, as its owner felt less like an arrival and more like an intrusion. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath her sensible shoes and the occasional rustle of a startled bird in the overgrown eaves. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating forgotten tapestries, intricately carved furniture draped in white sheets, and countless framed photographs of stern-faced ancestors whose gazes seemed to follow her with an unnerving persistence. Among these antique treasures, one particular piece immediately commanded her attention, drawing her gaze with an almost magnetic pull. It hung in the grand foyer, directly opposite the heavy oak front door, dominating the space with its sheer scale and somber intensity. It was a life-sized oil portrait, meticulously rendered, depicting a man from the early 1800s. He was tall, gaunt, with sharp, almost predatory features, and eyes of such an astonishingly dark hue that they seemed to absorb the light around them, leaving only an impenetrable depth. His attire was of the period, a dark, impeccably tailored coat, a high collar, and a cravat. His left hand rested on the pommel of a walking stick, but it was his right hand, half obscured by shadow, that held a peculiar fascination for Eleanor. It seemed slightly too long, the fingers tapered and unnaturally pale, almost skeletal. Below him, painted with equal detail, was his shadow. It stretched across the polished floorboards of the canvas, a dark, elongated echo of his imposing form. It was a common artistic device of the era, adding depth and realism to portraits. But even from her first glance, Eleanor sensed something subtly different about this one. It wasn't merely painted. It seemed to possess a peculiar, almost living quality. Over the next few days, as Eleanor began the daunting task of sorting through her aunt's affairs and making the manor somewhat habitable, the portrait became a constant, silent companion. She often found herself pausing in the foyer, her gaze drawn to it, trying to articulate the subtle unease it stirred within her. It began subtly, so subtly that at first she dismissed it as a trick of the eye, or perhaps the result of her own fatigue. As the morning sun streamed through the foyer windows, casting long, defined shadows across the real floor, the painted shadow in the portrait seemed to lengthen, to stretch with an impossible fluidity, mirroring the real shadows in the room. Later, as the afternoon light shifted, softening and diffusing, the painted shadow would appear to contract, its edges blurring, its form becoming less distinct. It was as if the painted shadow was not fixed, but rather responsive to the actual illumination of the room, an effect Eleanor had never witnessed in any other painting. "Impossible," she murmured to herself on the third day, circling the portrait slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. She moved a standing lamp closer, directing its beam squarely at the canvas. The painted shadow seemed to deepen, its outline sharpening, its length extending almost imperceptibly towards the bottom edge of the frame. She moved the lamp away, and the shadow appeared to recede, shrinking back to its original dimensions, albeit subtly. Her breath caught in her throat. This was not a trick of light on the glossy surface, not an optical illusion. The painted shadow was undeniably shifting. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the unique properties of the pigments, or the age of the canvas, reacting to temperature and humidity fluctuations. She even considered that Aunt Agnes, known for her eccentricities, might have employed some forgotten artistic technique, though the idea stretched credulity. Yet, the more she observed, the more she was forced to concede that something truly inexplicable was occurring. The man's shadow, within the confines of its painted world, behaved as if it were a real shadow, cast by a real light source. The man in the portrait, Eleanor learned from an old leather-bound family tree, was Bartholomew Blackwood, the original builder of the manor, a man of some notoriety in the early 19th century. Local legends, whispered in hushed tones, hinted at his dark dealings, his ruthless acquisition of land, and a chilling reputation for possessing an uncanny influence over others. He was said to have been a solitary, severe man, much like his painted likeness. As days turned into weeks, the subtle anomaly of the shadow began to warp Eleanor's perception of the house. The initial excitement of inheriting such a grand estate had given way to a creeping sense of unease. She found herself subconsciously checking the portrait whenever she passed through the foyer, her heart giving a little lurch each time she confirmed the shadow's peculiar dance. It wasn't just the shifting, Sometimes, in the dim twilight hours, as the last rays of sun faded from the windows, she swore the shadow seemed to ripple, as if a faint, unseen breeze stirred its painted depths. She began to feel a presence in the house, a cold, watchful gaze that wasn't tied to any living being. It was most pronounced in the foyer, especially near the portrait. She would sometimes turn sharply, convinced she had heard a soft creak or a sigh behind her, only to find nothing but the echoing silence of the old house. The air around the painting often felt distinctly cooler than the rest of the room, a chill that had nothing to do with drafts. One evening, Eleanor was in the library, attempting to distract herself with a book on local history, when the first clap of thunder rattled the old panes. A storm was brewing, a fierce summer tempest that rolled in from the distant hills with alarming speed. Rain began to lash against the windows, a drumming roar that quickly drowned out the soft murmurs of the house. The wind howled, a banshee cry through the ancient timbers, and the old manor groaned and shuddered as if protesting the assault. Eleanor lit a few more lamps, trying to dispel the growing gloom that pressed in from all sides. The electricity flickered once, then twice, a warning of things to come. The lights died with a soft pop, plunging the entire house into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The sudden void of light was profound, disorienting. The only sound was the relentless fury of the storm outside. A chill, deeper than any she had felt before, permeated the air. Eleanor's heart began to thud, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fumbled for the emergency lantern she kept on the mantel, her hands trembling slightly in the pitch black. The weak beam cut a hesitant path through the oppressive darkness, illuminating dancing dust and the vague outlines of forgotten furniture. She needed to check the fuse box in the cellar. But first, she needed to navigate the treacherous expanse of the ground floor. She moved slowly, carefully, the lantern's beam swinging a narrow arc before her. The house, stripped of its electric glow, felt vastly different, larger, more ominous. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the eaves seemed amplified, taking on a sinister quality. As she edged her way towards the grand staircase that led to the cellar, she found herself, inevitably, passing through the foyer. The lantern's beam, held aloft, swept across the dark, silent space. And then, her eyes fell upon the portrait. Even in the dim, flickering light, the somber face of Bartholomew Blackwood seemed to hold an even deeper, more menacing quality. His painted eyes, she swore, gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. Driven by an inexplicable, morbid curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need to confirm her sanity one last time, Eleanor paused. She held the lantern higher, directing its focused beam squarely onto the painted canvas, illuminating the man, his severe expression, and, of course, his shadow. Her breath hitched, her blood ran cold, turning to icy slush in her veins. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The shadow of the man was no longer in the painting. The space below Bartholomew's painted feet was bare, the polished, depicted floorboards starkly empty, where the long, dark form of his shadow should have been. It was gone, utterly, terrifyingly gone from the canvas. A guttural gasp escaped Eleanor's throat, raw and involuntary. Her hand, clutching the lantern, began to shake violently, sending the beam dancing frantically around the foyer. Her gaze, wide with unspeakable horror, darted from the now shadowless painting to the wall directly behind her, the wall that the portrait faced. And there it was, cast enormous and grotesque upon the textured plaster, elongated and terrifyingly real, was the unmistakable shadow of Bartholomew Blackwood. It stretched from the floor to the ceiling, its form mimicking the man in the painting with chilling precision. The high collar, the severe profile, the impossibly long, pale fingers of his right hand now reaching out, almost touching the very spot where Eleanor stood. The flicker of the lantern made it writhe, as if struggling to free itself fully from the wall, to step into the shared space. A primal scream clawed its way up her throat, but it died there, choked by the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped her. Her mind, usually so sharp, so logical, dissolved into a maelstrom of raw, unadulterated fear. The very air around her seemed to thicken, growing heavy and frigid, laden with an ancient, malevolent presence. She felt it, cold and sharp, directly behind her. A whisper of disturbed air, a faint, phantom chill that caressed the nape of her neck. She was not alone. The shadow had truly left its painted prison, and it was no longer merely a representation. It was a presence, freed and undoubtedly aware of her. Its long, painted fingers, now a terrifyingly real shadow, seemed to curl, beckoning, or perhaps reaching. In the suffocating darkness of Blackwood Manor, illuminated only by the frantic dance of her trembling lantern, Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the portrait had merely been a temporary holding place. And now, the true proprietor of Blackwood Manor had finally stepped out of the frame. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest of terror within her soul, as the silent, elongated shadow on the wall seemed to swell, consuming the light, preparing to finally, irrevocably, consume her. 8th story. The rules of the sleep-wake bridge. Eleanor knew the precise ache of a soul starved for slumber. For years, sleep had been a fleeting phantom, a cruel tease that danced just beyond her grasp, leaving her perpetually adrift in a haze of exhaustion. Her days were a struggle against the relentless tide of fatigue, her nights an endless, agonizing vigil. Doctors offered pills, therapists suggested routines, but nothing truly quieted the frantic hum of her mind. She yearned for oblivion, for the sweet release of unconsciousness, but it remained stubbornly, maddeningly out of reach. It was during one particularly desperate night, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th hour of staring at her ceiling, that the idea began to form. It wasn't a conscious decision, so much as an instinct, a primal urge to create a pathway, a mental space where sleep might finally find her. She started with a simple image, a long, wooden bridge. In her mind's eye, she built it plank by plank, sturdy and ancient, stretching into an infinite, swirling gray fog. There was no sky, no ground, just the rough-hewn timbers beneath her bare feet, and the impenetrable mist all around. She began to walk. Each step was deliberate, a silent mantra. Left, right, left, right. The rhythmic cadence of her mental footsteps became a lullaby, a monotonous yet mesmerizing beat that slowly, miraculously, began to quiet the cacophony in her head. The fog swallowed all sound, all thought, all anxiety. There was only the bridge and her solitary journey across it. The first time she reached what felt like the end of the mental walk, she simply fell. Not physically, but into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind she hadn't experienced in what felt like a lifetime. It became her ritual, her secret passageway to respite, Every night, she would close her eyes, construct the bridge, and step onto its weathered planks. She found that the clearer the visualization, the more unwavering her focus, the faster the descent into sleep. The bridge became her sanctuary, a dependable route through the chaotic static of her insomnia. Over time, as her nocturnal journeys across the sleep-wake bridge became a cornerstone of her existence, Eleanor began to notice subtle nuances within the mental landscape. The fog, while ever present, sometimes seemed to shift and eddy, hinting at unseen depths. The bridge itself felt impossibly long, yet she never quite reached an end, only the point where her consciousness blurred and surrendered. More strikingly, she realized she wasn't always alone. Shadowy figures, indistinct and silent, occasionally appeared on the bridge, walking in the same direction, their forms swallowed by the mist just as quickly as they emerged. They never spoke, never acknowledged her, simply moved with the same monotonous purpose. They were like fellow travelers on a shared, silent pilgrimage to the land of sleep. It was the emergence of these other travelers that prompted Eleanor to establish her rules. Not consciously at first, but instinctively, as if the bridge itself whispered them into her subconscious. The rules were simple, yet absolute, carved into the very essence of her nightly ritual. They were the commandments of her mental sanctuary, the safeguards against the unsettling unknowns that lurked in the periphery of her constructed reality. The first rule: never look over the side. The swirling gray fog beneath the bridge was a constant, tempting mystery. It offered no glimpse of what lay beyond or beneath, just an endless, featureless expanse that seemed to stretch into utter nothingness. Yet there was an undeniable pull, a subtle urge to lean closer, to peer into the indistinct depths. Eleanor had felt it, a faint, dizzying sensation, a whisper of a void that promised not sleep, but something far more chilling. She knew, with an intuitive certainty that bypassed logic, that to look down was to invite the unknown, to acknowledge a presence that was best left undisturbed. It was the boundary, the unspoken edge of her controlled reality. The second rule: never stop walking. The bridge demanded constant motion. To pause, even for a moment, felt like an anchor dropping, snagging her from the flow towards unconsciousness. When she had first begun her journeys, she had occasionally hesitated, wondering where she was going, what lay ahead. Each pause brought a peculiar stillness, an unnatural silence that felt heavy and expectant, as if the fog itself was holding its breath, waiting. The figures, too, would seem to slow, their indistinct forms growing subtly more defined in her peripheral vision. It was unsettling. Movement, she realized, was security. It was a distraction, a focus that kept her mind from wandering into territories best left unexplored. It was the rhythm that led her home to sleep. And the third, most crucial rule: never acknowledge the other silent, shadowy figures walking in the same direction. They were there, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, never more than blurry outlines against the omnipresent gray. Sometimes they appeared as tall, elongated forms, at others, squat and low to the planks. They moved with the same relentless pace, parallel to her, yet utterly separate. To acknowledge them, she feared, would be to invite interaction, to break the delicate illusion of her solitary journey. What were they? Other insomniacs, like her, creating their own bridges to sleep? Or something else entirely? Entities native to the fog, merely sharing the path? The thought sent a shiver down her mental spine. Maintaining their anonymity, their non-existence in her perception, was paramount to her safety. They were background noise, nothing more, and she dared not give them the energy of her attention. For years, these rules were her salvation. They were the unseen guardrails that kept her on the path to restful slumber. She walked her bridge every night, a silent, disciplined trekker, adhering to her laws with the unwavering devotion of a convert. And it worked. The insomnia, once a monstrous tormentor, had been tamed, confined to the waking hours, its reach unable to extend into the sacred space of her sleep-wake bridge. Eleanor lived her life, exhausted still, but no longer ravaged, because she had found her escape. She had built her peace on planks and fog, guided by silent, unbreakable decrees. The years rolled on, each night a repetition of the last, a journey across the familiar, comforting expanse of her mental bridge. The rules, once consciously enforced, had become second nature, ingrained into the very fabric of her nightly ritual. She no longer had to remind herself not to look down, not to stop, not to acknowledge. It was simply how she walked. The bridge was a haven, a place of predictable solitude that always, without fail, delivered her to the sweet oblivion she craved. But time, even in the mind's most steadfast constructs, has a way of wearing down edges. The stresses of her waking life, though managed, began to accumulate. A particularly draining week at work, a bout of restless anxiety about a forgotten bill, a subtle, cumulative erosion of her mental fortitude. She found herself more tired than usual, the familiar fatigue a heavier cloak. The bridge felt longer, the fog perhaps a little denser, the journey infinitesimally more arduous. One night, the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her eyelids, clouding her thoughts even as she began her mental walk. She stepped onto the bridge, the familiar cool touch of the planks beneath her bare feet. The rhythmic thump-thump of her mental steps echoed in the silence. But tonight, it felt less like a lullaby and more like a monotonous drumbeat, urging her onward, yet also highlighting her profound weariness. The shadowy figures seemed closer, their indistinct forms a little more present in her peripheral vision, their silent progression almost palpable. She ignored them, as always, focusing on the planks directly in front of her. Her mind, however, was not as sharp as it usually was. A fleeting thought of the day's trivial worries, a momentary lapse in concentration, and then it happened. Her mental foot caught on an imaginary knot in the wood, or perhaps she simply stumbled from sheer exhaustion. Her balance wavered, and her arm, an instinct born of countless physical stumbles in the waking world, shot out. Her hand reached for the railing that bordered the bridge, a desperate attempt to steady herself. But there was no railing. Her hand passed through what should have been solid wood, through the insubstantial boundary of her mental construct. For a fraction of a second, she felt nothing but the emptiness of the fog, an unnerving chill where the warmth of her hand should have met the roughness of wood. It was a jolt, a sudden, jarring disruption of the absolute certainty she had always felt on the bridge. The rules, the absolute, unyielding rules, had been built on the premise of a tangible structure, a reliable pathway. And now, for the first time, a part of it had proven to be a lie. In that singular moment of disorientation, the instinct to recover her balance, warred with a deeper, more primal urge. The boundary had been breached, the illusion momentarily shattered, and as her hand passed through the phantom railing, her eyes, against everything she had ever commanded them to do, instinctively followed. She looked down. The swirling gray fog, usually an indistinct blanket, was no longer merely formless. It moved. It pulsed. And from within its depths, something looked back up at her. It wasn't a distinct face, not a single, cohesive entity in the way her waking mind understood. It was a terrifying, shifting constellation of features, as if the fog itself had congealed into a malevolent awareness. There were eyes, not two, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, small and luminous, like pinpricks of icy light, scattered across an unseen, vast surface. They were ancient, unblinking, and they held a hunger so profound, so utterly cold, that it seemed to drain the warmth from the mental air around her. And teeth, glimpses of them, razor-sharp edges appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist, rows upon rows of them, forming a silent, cavernous maw that seemed to open and close in a slow, suffocating rhythm. It was not a roar, not a sound in the traditional sense, but a presence, a feeling of immense, predatory intelligence, a vast, patient emptiness that had lain dormant, waiting. As she stared, frozen, into that shifting abyss of eyes and teeth and raw, unadulterated hunger, a single, horrifying realization solidified in her mind. It knew. It knew she was there. It knew the bridge. And now, after years of her diligently walking past its hidden vigil, it knew the way to her side of the bridge. A gasp tore itself from her throat, a sound that somehow echoed not in her room, but within the boundless expanse of the fog. She wrenched her gaze away, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing entirely, and scrambled away from the edge, away from the yawning maw that had just revealed itself. Sleep was a distant, forgotten concept. Her eyes flew open, snapping Eleanor back into the oppressive familiarity of her bedroom. The room was dark, but a faint sliver of moonlight cut through the blinds, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She sat bolt upright, drenched in a cold sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands trembled, and she instinctively looked down at them, as if expecting to see the lingering chill of the fog. The next few days were a blur of pervasive unease. Eleanor tried to rationalize it away. It was a nightmare, she told herself. Just a particularly vivid, unsettling nightmare, born of chronic sleep deprivation. Her mind, pushed to its limits, had finally conjured something truly grotesque. But the logic felt thin, flimsy, like a single thread trying to hold back a monstrous tide. The image of those unblinking eyes, the flash of those endless teeth, was seared into her consciousness. It played on a loop behind her eyes, a silent, chilling film. That night, she avoided the bridge. The thought of stepping onto those planks, of re-entering that mental space, was unbearable. The idea of it being there, waiting, perhaps even having followed her, was too terrifying to contemplate. She tried other methods, counting sheep, deep breathing exercises, audiobooks. Nothing worked. The insomnia, which had been placated for so long, returned with a vengeance, fiercer and more suffocating than ever before. Every shadow in her room seemed to deepen. Every creak of the house sounded ominous. She felt a pervasive sense of being watched, a subtle prickling on the back of her neck, even when she was alone. The following night, The exhaustion was so profound, it bordered on agony. She knew she couldn't last much longer. The bridge, for all its newfound terror, was still the only path she knew to sleep. With a shaking resolve, she closed her eyes, forcing herself to visualize the familiar planks. It was there, just as before. The fog, the bridge, the quiet, almost. This time, the silence felt different. It was heavier, more expectant. And the shadowy figures, they seemed more numerous, closer, their outlines sharper than she remembered. They didn't just walk in parallel. Sometimes, one would seem to drift slightly closer, their form momentarily elongating, as if stretching towards her, before receding back into the mist. She ignored them, desperately trying to focus on the planks beneath her feet, forcing herself to keep walking, never to look down. But the bridge felt different. The planks felt colder, the air heavier. The edge, where she had looked down, seemed to shimmer in her peripheral vision, drawing her eye. She could feel its presence, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated through the very timbers of the bridge. It was there, just beneath, watching. Sleep, when it finally came, was no longer a release. It was a fragile, restless state, filled with fragmented images of swirling fog, unblinking eyes, and a profound, bone-deep cold. She would wake suddenly, gasping, convinced she had heard a faint scraping sound from just outside her window, or caught a fleeting glimpse of a distorted shadow by her bedroom door. The presence, once confined to her mental construct, began to bleed into her waking life. She would be making coffee, and the clatter of a mug would sound strangely hollow, as if the air itself had thinned. She would glance at her reflection in a shop window, and for a split second, catch a glimpse of something tall and gaunt, standing just behind her, its form indistinct, before it vanished. The whispers started subtly, just at the edge of hearing, like the rustling of dry leaves or the scuttling of something unseen. They were always too soft to discern words, but the feeling they conveyed was unmistakable: malevolence, curiosity, and a growing impatience. Eleanor stopped sleeping well entirely. Even when she managed to enter the bridge, the journey was a torment. The rules, once her protectors, now felt like a desperate, futile attempt to hold back an inevitable invasion. She was hyper-aware of the figures, their silent procession, a constant, unnerving reminder of the broken boundary. She could almost feel their eyes on her back, their silent judgment. And beneath the bridge, the presence was undeniable. It wasn't just waiting, it was reaching. A cold, tendril-like sensation would sometimes brush against the mental planks, making her recoil, even in her half-asleep state. She tried to fight it. She tried to think of other places, other mental pathways to sleep. A sunny field, a cozy cottage, a calm ocean. But the bridge was too ingrained, too powerful a mental anchor. Her mind would always, inevitably, return to the planks, to the fog, to the palpable presence beneath. The bridge wasn't just a technique anymore. It had become a nexus, a thin place between her reality and something else. And the thing she had awakened, the thing made of eyes and teeth and cold hunger, was now firmly on the threshold. The dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. They weren't about the bridge itself, but about the feeling of the bridge. Dreams of being trapped in endless corridors of fog, of being pursued by a formless, multi-eyed entity, its presence a suffocating weight. She would wake up screaming, tangled in her sheets, the sounds of her own terror echoing in the silence of her apartment. One particularly grim morning, Eleanor caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her eyes were sunken, dark hollows, in a face that was pale and drawn. But it wasn't just the exhaustion. There was a look in her eyes she didn't recognize, a flicker of something ancient and knowing, something that seemed to have peered into an abyss and had been indelibly marked by it. And for a fleeting moment, just behind her shoulder in the reflection, she saw it. Not a shadow, but a deeper void, a concentration of the deepest gray, with faint, pinprick glimmers. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the message was clear. It was no longer just reaching. It was crossing. The boundary between the sleep-wake bridge and her reality was dissolving. The whispers were louder now, almost coherent, though she still couldn't make out words, only a sibilant, hungry hiss. She began to see the fleeting, shadowy figures, not just in reflections, but in the corners of her vision, always just out of direct sight, always gone when she turned her head. They were the silent travelers from the bridge, now walking the edges of her waking world. The final night came with a heavy, suffocating dread. Eleanor lay in bed, her body trembling, her mind screaming for sleep, even as it recoiled from the only path available. She fought it, fought the pull of the bridge, fought the exhaustion that threatened to drag her under. But it was stronger than her. The fog was no longer a mental construct. It seemed to swirl at the edges of her bedroom. The rhythmic thump-thump of invisible footsteps echoed, not in her mind, but from the very floorboards beneath her. She closed her eyes, not to invite sleep, but because she could no longer keep them open against the immense pressure. And there it was, the bridge. Only now, it wasn't just a visualization. It felt real, tangible. The planks were rough beneath her feet. The cold, damp fog swirled around her. And the figures, they were no longer shadowy blurs. They were taller, gaunter, their forms defined by the very absence of light, their heads bowed, their silent progress unwavering. They felt closer, too close. She heard a soft, wet, sloshing sound from beneath the planks. The rhythmic thump-thump of their footsteps paused, ever so slightly. And then, a sound. A slow, wet scrape from directly beneath her, followed by another. The bridge shuddered. Eleanor didn't need to look down. She could feel it rising, feel the sheer mass of it pressing against the underside of the planks, vibrating through the wood and into her very bones. The air grew impossibly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your marrow. The smell of damp earth and something putrid, something ancient and unburrowed, filled the air. The rhythmic thud of the other figure's steps resumed, unwavering, moving forward, away from her. They were leaving her. A plank beside her gave a soft groan, and slowly, deliberately, began to tilt inward, pulled by an unseen force. A single, luminous, pinprick eye, impossibly bright and filled with an unbearable hunger, appeared in the gap, then another, and another, and more, until the shifting mass of them began to ooze through the widening fissure in the bridge. The last thing Eleanor registered, before the cold hunger consumed her entirely, was the soft, sibilant hiss that seemed to permeate the very fog, a sound of triumphant knowing. It had found its way, and now the bridge was open. 9th story, the Sweetheart Doll. Arthur Finch was, by all accounts, a man consumed by the past. Not the grand, sweeping narratives of history, but the intimate, often forgotten remnants of lives lived and objects cherished. His home, a sprawling Victorian, nestled amongst ancient oaks, was less a residence and more a museum of forgotten childhoods. Porcelain figures with cracked smiles, tin soldiers frozen in mid-charge, and clockwork contraptions that whirred with hesitant life filled every available surface. His passion, however, truly lay with dolls. Not the pristine, plastic creations of modern times, but the kind with painted cheeks and glassy eyes, dolls that had witnessed decades, absorbing the silent echoes of the homes they once inhabited. It was at an estate sale, held in a grand, dusty mansion whose previous owner had been a reclusive eccentric, that Arthur first saw her. She was tucked away in a shadowed corner, almost hidden beneath a pile of faded linens. A sweetheart doll, the tag declared, dating her to the 1950s. She was larger than most, almost the size of a human infant, with plump, rosy cheeks, a shock of synthetic blonde hair tied with a tarnished ribbon, and a simple yet intriguing mechanism. When you laid her down, her painted blue eyes would close with a gentle click. When you sat her up, they would spring open, wide and unblinking. There was something about her, not overtly beautiful, certainly not frightening, but an undeniable presence, a kind of quiet gravity. Arthur, accustomed to the peculiar aura of old things, felt it keenly. He purchased her without hesitation, adding her to the careful, curated chaos of his collection room, a space dedicated solely to his most prized acquisitions. He placed her on a high, antique mahogany shelf, positioning her so her open, blue eyes seemed to survey the room, a silent sentinel among his other treasures. That night, Arthur was pulled from a deep, dreamless sleep by a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a soft thud, a subtle shifting from the direction of his collection room. He lay for a moment, disoriented by the abrupt awakening, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps a gust of wind had dislodged something, or the old house was simply settling. But the sound, though not repeated, had been distinct. A curious unease prickled at the back of his neck. Slipping out of bed, he padded barefoot across the cold floorboards, his steps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The moonlight, filtering through the tall windows, cast long, distorted shadows, transforming familiar objects into monstrous shapes. He reached the door to the collection room, pushing it open, slowly, hesitantly. The room was still and silent, bathed in the pale, ethereal glow of the moon. His gaze swept across the shelves, past the rows of dolls and antique toys, until it landed on the mahogany shelf where he had placed the sweetheart doll. She wasn't there. A cold knot tightened in Arthur's stomach. He stepped further into the room, his eyes darting around, and then he saw her. She was sitting in the exact center of the polished hardwood floor, directly beneath the shelf where she had rested. Her legs were splayed out in front of her, and her head was tilted slightly to the side. Her painted blue eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at the doorway, at him. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. It was preposterous, impossible. He must have misplaced her. Perhaps she had fallen when he put her on the shelf, and he hadn't noticed. Yes, that was it. A simple accident. He strode forward, the floorboards groaning faintly beneath his weight, and picked her up. She felt surprisingly heavy, solid in his hands. He carefully placed her back on the shelf, ensuring she was stable this time, her eyes closing with that familiar, gentle click as he laid her down. He told himself it was nothing, just an old house, a clumsy owner, and an overactive imagination. He returned to bed, but sleep proved elusive. The image of the doll, sitting in the middle of the floor, its eyes wide, replayed itself in his mind. He finally drifted off sometime before dawn, a vague sense of disquiet lingering. The next night, the scenario repeated itself with an unnerving precision. Arthur was once again roused from his sleep by that same faint sound, a soft, almost imperceptible thud from the collection room. A tremor of dread ran through him this time. He knew, with a chilling certainty, what he would find. He made his way to the collection room, the air growing colder with each step. And there she was again, sitting in the middle of the floor, in the exact same spot, her painted blue eyes open wide, fixed on the doorway. This time, Arthur didn't try to rationalize it. He didn't bother with theories of accidental falls or settling houses. A cold, creeping fear began to take root in his mind. He picked up the doll, his hands trembling slightly, and placed her back on the shelf. Her eyes clicked shut. He stared at her for a long moment, a shiver running down his spine, before retreating to his bed, leaving the door to the collection room ajar, as if to keep a watchful eye. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, every shadow a potential movement, every creak of the house a prelude to something unseen. He considered locking the doll away, perhaps even getting rid of her. But his collector's instinct, his innate desire to preserve and understand, warred with his growing apprehension. He told himself it was still just a coincidence, a trick of the light, a phantom of his own anxieties. He would wait. Just one more night. The third night arrived, bringing with it a palpable sense of tension. Arthur found himself unable to relax, unable to shake the feeling of impending dread. He tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. He tried to listen to music, but the notes seemed dissonant, unsettling. He finally gave up, turning off the lights and lying in bed, his eyes wide open in the darkness, listening. The hours crawled by, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall amplifying the silence of the house. He thought about the doll, about her unblinking eyes, about the way she appeared in the middle of the room. He told himself it was absurd, a figment of his imagination. He was a grown man, a scholar of forgotten things, not a child afraid of a toy. And then he heard it. The sound, that soft, distinct thud, the shifting weight. But this time, it wasn't coming from the collection room. It was coming from the foot of his bed. Arthur froze, every muscle in his body locked. He held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. The room was shrouded in oppressive darkness, impenetrable and suffocating. He heard another sound then, closer this time, a faint, almost inaudible scrape, as if something was being dragged across the rug. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he reached out a hand, fumbling for the lamp on his bedside table. His fingers brushed against the cool metal, and with a desperate surge of adrenaline, he flicked the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and sudden, chasing away the shadows. Arthur's eyes, wide with terror, immediately dropped to the foot of his bed. There she was, the sweetheart doll. She was sitting on a plush rug, her back to him, facing the wall. But that wasn't what made the scream catch in his throat, what made his blood run cold. One of her hands, small and plastic, was resting on the hem of his blanket, and her head, which should have been fixed in place, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning. First, her painted cheek came into view, then her ear, And then, with a soft, almost imperceptible click, her head turned fully, and her painted blue eyes, wide open and unblinking, stared directly into his. There was no longer any doubt. She was looking at him, and in their depth, he saw not the blank stare of a toy, but something ancient, something knowing, something utterly, terrifyingly alive. 10th story. The scent of rust and rain. The vast, sprawling expanse of the Blackwood National Park was Ranger Elias Thorne's dominion, his sanctuary, and increasingly, his silent tormentor. Miles upon miles of ancient pines, gnarled oaks, and whispering aspens stretched out under an impossibly wide sky, punctuated by glacial lakes that shimmered like forgotten jewels. Elias had dedicated nearly 15 years of his life to this wilderness, knowing every trail, every secret glade, every subtle shift in the wind. He was a man of the earth, solitary by nature, finding solace in the rhythmic crunch of pine needles beneath his boots and the distant cry of a hawk. His small, weathered cabin, nestled deep within a less frequented section of the park, was his haven, a quiet outpost against the encroaching world. It began subtly, as most insidious things do. He was on his usual patrol route, a meandering path that took him through the heart of a particularly old-growth forest, eventually opening into a wide, sun-dappled clearing known locally as Whisperwind Meadow. It was a place he loved, a serene canvas of wildflowers in spring and tall, swaying grasses in summer, where the air usually carried the clean, invigorating scent of pine resin and damp earth. But on that particular Tuesday, under a sky so clear and achingly blue it seemed painted, something else hung in the air. Elias paused, his senses immediately alert, trained by years of wilderness, living to detect anomalies. It was a distinct odor, unmistakable and utterly out of place. The metallic tang of rust, sharp and earthy, mingled with the sweet, deep aroma of petrichor, that rich, unmistakable scent of rain on parched soil. It was the smell of a summer storm that had just passed, of a downpour saturating thirsty ground. Except there had been no storm. Not for days. The earth beneath his boots was dry, the leaves on the trees unwashed by any recent precipitation. The sun beat down, warm and golden, casting long, peaceful shadows. Elias frowned, his eyes scanning the clearing. No discarded farm equipment, no old, rusting vehicles, nothing that could account for such a powerful metallic scent. He walked the perimeter of the meadow, sniffing the air like a hound, trying to pinpoint the source. He knelt, ran his fingers through the dry soil, even sniffed the bark of a nearby ancient oak. Nothing. The scent seemed to hang everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied presence in the otherwise pristine air. He chalked it up to an anomaly, a trick of the wind, perhaps some distant agricultural machinery he couldn't see, or even a brief, localized microburst of rain he had somehow missed. He was a rational man, grounded in observable facts and the logic of the natural world. Legends and inexplicable phenomena were the stuff of campfire tales, not the daily reality of a park ranger. But the smell returned. A week later, on his next patrol through Whisperwind Meadow, the air was again crystal clear, the sun high, and the scent of rust and rain was back, stronger this time. It clung to the air like an invisible shroud, a tangible presence that Elias couldn't shake. He spent a full hour this time, meticulously searching. He checked for hidden springs, for any unusual mineral deposits, even for signs of a small, recent fire that might have left a metallic ash. he found nothing. The meadow was as it always was, an expanse of green and gold, silent, save for the hum of insects. This second occurrence, so soon after the first, began to chip away at his composure. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was a pattern, albeit a baffling one. He found himself thinking about it in the evenings, his mind replaying the bizarre sensory experience. He started to question his own perception. Was he tired? Was his sense of smell playing tricks on him? He even considered the possibility of some strange, rare botanical phenomenon, though he'd never encountered anything like it in all his years. The third time, the scent was almost overwhelming. He could taste the metallic tang at the back of his throat, feel the damp coolness that seemed to emanate from the petrichor, even though the air was dry and warm. It was early afternoon, the sky a vast, empty canvas of blue. He stood in the center of Whisperwind Meadow, his eyes closed, breathing deeply, trying to reconcile the sensory input with the visual reality. It felt like standing in a downpour that wasn't there, surrounded by an old, abandoned factory that had somehow materialized out of thin air. He couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't a trick of the light or a passing fancy. This was real, whatever this was, and it was unsettling him deeply. Elias was a man who prided himself on his self-reliance and his ability to understand his environment. This phenomenon defied all his accumulated knowledge. That evening, back in the small town that bordered the eastern edge of the park, where he went once a week for supplies, he found himself drawn to the dusty general store. Old Jebediah, the proprietor, was a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each one a testament to years lived under the open sky. He'd seen generations of rangers come and go, and knew the park stories, both official and unofficial, better than anyone. Elias bought his usual coffee and canned goods, then hesitated. Jebediah, he began, trying to sound casual. You ever notice anything peculiar about Whisperwind Meadow? Jebediah, wiping down the counter with a slow, deliberate motion, grunted. Peculiar how, Ranger Thorn? A smell, Elias said, trying to describe it without sounding entirely unhinged. Like rust and rain, but only when it's clear and dry. Jebediah stopped wiping, his eyes, the color of faded denim, fixed on Elias. A slow, knowing smile spread across his ancient face, a smile that held 1,000 untold stories. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. Ah, the scent of rust and rain, is it? Thought I'd heard the last of that one. Elias felt a prickle of unease. Heard of it? What is it? Jebediah straightened, walked around the counter, and settled onto an old, creaky stool. He gestured for Elias to sit on the stool opposite him. It's an old tale, Ranger. Older than these pines, some say. Passed down through the generations of folks who've lived on the edge of these woods. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts, or perhaps enjoying the dramatic effect. They say, Jebediah continued, his voice barely above a whisper, that when you smell rust and rain, with no clouds in the sky, it means something that should not be there, is remembering what it was like to be made of iron and flesh. Elias felt a chill trace its way down his spine. Iron and flesh, he repeated, a tremor in his voice he immediately regretted. Jebediah nodded, his gaze unwavering. Aye, something that was once solid, living, breathing, something that perhaps moved like a man or an animal, but was forged from the very earth, from the minerals deep within it. And now, it's just memory. A memory so powerful, it conjures its own weather. He paused again, his eyes twinkling. And it's weeping for the sky it can no longer see. The silence in the store stretched, heavy and profound. Elias tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as an old wives' tale. But Jebediah's conviction, the way his words had settled into the quiet air, made it impossible. Weeping for the sky it can no longer see, he murmured, the phrase resonating with an unexpected pathos. That's right, Jebediah confirmed. They say it misses the sun, the stars, the feeling of the wind. It's a sad thing, really. A lonely thing, trapped in some form of existence between what it was and what it is now. Elias thanked Jebediah, his mind a turbulent sea of disbelief and unsettling curiosity. He left the store with his supplies, but the conversation and Jebediah's words had burrowed deep into his thoughts. Something that should not be there, remembering what it was like to be made of iron and flesh. It sounded like the ramblings of the superstitious, yet it provided a strange, macabre explanation for the inexplicable. He tried to tell himself it was just a story, a folklore attempt to explain natural phenomena. But the image of something weeping, unseen, for the sky it could no longer see, was difficult to dislodge. Back in the solitude of his cabin, the park felt different. The comforting expanse now seemed to harbor unseen things, old sorrows, and perhaps impossible beings. He found himself glancing out his window into the deepening twilight, a nervous energy thrumming beneath his skin. The next few weeks were a descent into a quiet, pervasive dread. The scent of rust and rain became a more frequent companion. It wasn't confined to Whisperwind Meadow anymore. He started to detect it on other trails, initially faint, a ghostly whisper on the breeze, but then growing stronger. He'd be checking a trap line near Boulder Creek, a good 2 miles from the meadow, and suddenly, the distinct aroma would bloom in the air around him, sharp and cold despite the warmth of the day. Then it started appearing closer to his ranger station. One crisp morning, as he stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, to greet the rising sun, he caught it. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. It was the delicate interplay of rust and petrichor right there on his own porch. He froze, his senses straining. The air was still, clear, the morning dew still clinging to the grass. No clouds, no hint of rain. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was as if whatever caused the smell was moving, slowly, inexorably, towards his sanctuary. He started carrying a small notebook, meticulously noting every instance of the smell. The date, the time, the exact location, the intensity. It was a futile attempt to impose order on a chaotic, supernatural phenomenon, but it was all he could do to maintain a semblance of control. The entries grew more frequent, the distances between occurrences shrinking. Whisperwind Meadow, Boulder Creek, the Old Pine Ridge, the Bear Cave Trail, and then October 14th, 9 a.m., east side of Ranger Station. Faint but distinct, clear sky. October 16th, 2:30 p.m., just beyond my property line, near the old oak. Strong, sunny. October 19th, 6 a.m., on the path to my outhouse. Very strong, no wind. Sleep became a luxury. Elias would lie awake, listening to the night sounds, his mind racing. Was it just the wind, carrying the scent from a distant source? But the consistency, the lack of actual rain, the specific combination of odors, it defied any logical explanation. He found himself peering into the darkness outside his windows, half expecting to see some amorphous shape, some weeping, iron-fleshed thing coalescing in the shadows. His logical, scientific mind battled constantly with the chilling image of Jebediah's legend. He began to feel a profound sense of isolation. Who would believe him? He was a respected ranger, a practical man. To report that he was being haunted by a smell linked to a supernatural weeping entity, would be to invite ridicule, perhaps even a forced leave of absence. He was alone with this, truly alone. The scent, once merely unsettling, began to feel like a presence. It was a warning, a lament, or perhaps a slow, inevitable approach. He imagined it crawling on its unseen belly through the undergrowth, slithering closer with each passing day, leaving its peculiar olfactory footprint in its wake. He started leaving his cabin door ajar, sometimes, as if to test the boundaries, to see if the scent would dare cross his threshold. It never did. Not then. It always stopped, just shy, a phantom barrier holding it at bay. One evening, as a cold, late autumn wind began to bite at the bare branches outside, Elias was cooking a simple dinner, the comforting aroma of simmering stew filling his small kitchen. Suddenly, the distinct metallic tang of rust cut through the savory warmth, followed by the damp, earthy sweetness of petrichor. It was undeniable. He dropped his spoon with a clatter. The scent was inside his cabin. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was there, faint but present, seeping in through the cracks around the window frames, under the door, through the very walls. It mingled with the stew, turning the comforting smell into something grotesque and unsettling. Elias spun around, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, as if expecting to see the source materialize. He walked to the window, pressed his face to the cold glass. The night outside was black, starless, and utterly still. No rain, no storm. His breath hitched in his throat. It had crossed the threshold. The barrier was broken. He didn't sleep at all that night. He sat in his armchair by the cold hearth, a heavy lamp casting long, dancing shadows, clutching his hunting knife. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sounded amplified, ominous. The faint scent of rust and rain persisted, a phantom guest that refused to leave. The next morning, the smell was stronger, lingering like stale perfume. He went about his duties mechanically, his movements stiff, his eyes bloodshot. He canceled his patrol for the day, unable to face the thought of venturing further into the park, not with the knowledge that it was now with him, inside his home. He started to feel watched, even within the confines of his cabin. The silence, once comforting, became oppressive. He imagined unseen eyes, perhaps not eyes at all, but some ancient, formless consciousness, observing him, remembering its own agony, its own transformation from something living to something else. The scent intensified with each passing hour, becoming a constant, cloying presence. It was in his clothes, his hair, even seemed to cling to the food he ate. He opened all the windows and doors, letting the frigid autumn air blast through. But it did nothing. The smell was not external. It was internal. It was as if the air itself had been imbued with the memory of a metallic grief. His mind, once so clear and rational, began to fray at the edges. He found himself talking aloud, arguing with the invisible presence. "What do you want?" he'd whisper into the empty air, his voice hoarse. "Why here? Why me?" There was, of course, no answer. Only the pervasive, sickeningly sweet scent of rust and rain, growing stronger, like an approaching storm that would never break. He spent his days in a fog of fear, his nights in a terrified vigil. The park, his beloved park, had turned against him, or rather, something within it had chosen him for its silent, weeping lament. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man of the earth, now haunted by the very minerals that formed it. One afternoon, a sharp, metallic tang burned his nostrils, stronger than ever before. It was almost acrid now, no longer just rust, but something sharper, like old blood. And the petrichor was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself were weeping. Elias stumbled back, clutching his chest. He could barely breathe. The air in his cabin was thick with it, palpable, like an unseen mist. He looked down at his hands, then at his clothes, his mind racing, desperate for a tangible source. Nothing. Then he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the dark, still pane of his window. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dilated with fear. And then he noticed it. Tiny, shimmering droplets, like beads of condensation, were appearing on the glass from the inside, slowly, one by one, trailing down like tears. And as he watched, horrified, a faint, reddish tint began to bloom within each droplet, like rust blooming on forgotten iron. He stepped closer, reaching out a trembling finger, and touched one. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and left a faint, metallic residue on his skin. He brought his finger to his nose. The smell, strongest here, right from the weeping window. It was no longer just outside. It was inside his walls, inside his home. It was seeping from the very fabric of his sanctuary. And it was no longer just the smell of remembering. It was the smell of active, living, present grief. The iron and flesh, perhaps, wasn't just remembering. Perhaps it was stirring. Perhaps it was trying to see the sky again, not through a window, but through him. The thought, cold and sharp as a splinter of ice, pierced through his mounting terror. Elias Thorne stood in the center of his cabin, surrounded by the overwhelming scent of rust and rain, watching the weeping glass, and realized with a horrifying certainty that he was no longer alone in his wilderness. And the thing that accompanied him, the thing that wept for a sky it could no longer see, was now, definitively, inside. The air was heavy, charged with an invisible, ancient sorrow, and the metallic tang of something that had long been buried, now slowly, painfully, bleeding through the world. The silence, broken only by his own ragged breaths, was absolute, and the weeping continued. And so, our stories for tonight have been told. They now belong to the darkness, left to echo in the quiet corners of your mind. For those of you still with me, still floating in that gentle space between the waking world and the land of dreams, I have one last question for you. What is the strangest, most unexplainable sound you've ever heard when you were sure you were all alone? Leave a final thought in the comments, a last whisper into the void before you drift away completely. Until we meet again, may your dreams be deep and your shadows remain empty. Sleep well.